My wife did not even lift her eyes from the magazine she was reading. She said only half. Another executive analyzed the alarming rate of redemptions from Sogen's funds and claimed to have figured out the exact date, which was not very distant, at which we would be left with zero to manage. Evia felt under siege. Even the board of the fund went against me. They said, "How come you don't see what everybody else is seeing, which is that you have to be in the tech, media, and telecom stocks?" He tried to explain that his investment style was ill-suited to fast-changing sectors filled with racy companies trading at irrational valuations. But he sounded out of touch, a relic who didn't understand the wondrous innovations of the new economy. He'd always expected to suffer bouts of underperformance. In the past, he'd trailed the market for several months at a time. But 3 years. It had gone on for so long that there were days when I thought I was an idiot, he confesses. You do, in truth, start doubting yourself. Everybody seems to see the light. How come I don't see it? Was it possible that the markets had changed beyond recognition, and his investing style was no longer applicable? Julian Robertson, a hedge fund legend who generated stunning returns for 2 decades by betting on undervalued stocks and shorting overvalued stocks, closed his funds in early 2000. In a rational environment, this strategy functions well, Robertson grumbled. But in an irrational market, where earnings and price considerations take a back seat to mouse clicks and momentum, such logic, as we have learned, does not count for much. Still, Evia struggled on, refusing to abandon logic or retire. His mother once told him that he'd found the only occupation in which he could be reasonably successful. I think she may be right. On top of that, I only know how to do value investing. I could not operate differently. In the end, Société Générale found a tactful way to get rid of him. It sold his fund group to a small investment bank, Arnhold and S. Bleichroeder. Evia, who owned a 19.9% stake in the fund business, had worked at the same firm since 1962. Now, after 3 years of dismal underperformance, he was traded to another team like some washed-out athlete. The sale was almost comically mistimed. It was announced in October 1999, and the deal closed in January 2000. 2 months later, on March 10, the tech bubble burst. Evia's portfolio of bargain-price stocks performed superbly, as rationality reasserted itself. His flagship investment vehicle, now renamed the First Eagle Global Fund, trounced the Nasdaq by 49 percentage points in 2000, 31 percentage points in 2001, and 42 percentage points in 2002. Morningstar anointed Evia the International Stock Fund Manager of the Year for 2001. In 2003, he received Morningstar's inaugural Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of his outstanding long-term performance, alignment with his shareholders' best interests, and courage to differ from consensus. Investors are a fickle bunch. One year, Evia was a fossil and a fool. The next, he was a sage, revered by all. So much money poured in that his assets under management eventually rose to about $100 billion. His former bosses had sold the business at the bottom for 5% of its worth today, he says, with a mixture of resentment, sorrow, and satisfaction. Somebody told me that shortly afterwards they were eating their balls. Graham, who had also suffered on the road to glory, wouldn't have been surprised by the tale of Evia's rise and fall and rise. Graham opened security analysis with a quote from the Roman poet Horace: "Many shall be restored that now are fallen, and many shall fall that now are in honor." The unkindness of strangers. Evia had done everything right, yet his career was almost destroyed. So what's the lesson of his story? Above all, it highlights just how difficult it is to build sustainable investment success over decades, Given the multitude of destabilizing forces and unpredictable hazards we encounter along the way. Unlike many of his peers, Evia had some powerful advantages. He had the good fortune to stumble upon Graham's value-oriented principles, which gave him an analytical edge. He had the discipline to adhere to those principles through thick and thin, resisting the allure of overvalued stocks. And he had the emotional fortitude to endure his colleagues' contempt and override his own doubts. In short, he belonged to a small minority that's equipped intellectually and temperamentally to outperform over the long haul. Even so, these formidable strengths weren't sufficient to make him a truly resilient investor. How come? The trouble was, Evia operated from a position that was structurally unsound. First, he was at the mercy of his investors, since they could redeem their shares daily, forcing him to sell stocks when they were cheapest, instead of buying them. Their wayward emotions and erratic judgment posed an external threat over which he had no control. Second, he was acutely vulnerable to pressures from inside his own firm, including his colleagues, concerned that he threatened their financial interests by refusing to invest in tech. Even worse, he served at the pleasure or displeasure of his corporate masters. He wasn't in charge. It's hard enough to make rational decisions in a crazy market that has renounced traditional valuation measures. It's infinitely harder if you're also barraged by external pressures from shareholders jumping ship, colleagues with their own commercial agenda, and bosses who lose faith in you at precisely the wrong moment. As you can see from Evia's travails, fragility comes in many forms. So it follows that financial resilience must also be multifaceted. It's revealing that Buffett and Munger have structured Berkshire Hathaway to be resilient in every way. For example, they've vowed never to keep less than $20 billion in cash, so they'll never be caught out by a shortage of liquidity. When COVID-19 caused a market crash in 2020, Berkshire had $137 billion in cash, making it indestructible even in the face of unprecedented uncertainty. Buffett and Munger also buy high-quality businesses that should prosper for decades, even in times of turmoil or inflation. And their insurance operations are vastly overcapitalized, so they can withstand catastrophes that would bury weaker firms. Berkshire also has the structural advantage of being a public company, not a fund, so they're investing permanent capital that can never be yanked away by panicked shareholders. If you run a mutual fund, you're always worried that the shareholder will abandon you if you're temporarily not doing well, says Evia. To some extent, what Buffett has with Berkshire Hathaway is a closed-end fund. He can't suffer from redemptions. During the financial crisis, Berkshire's stock took a hit, plunging 50.7% from September 2008 to March 2009. But this short-term market volatility had zero impact on the long-term value of the business. On the contrary, Buffett used the crisis to boost Berkshire's value by injecting billions of dollars on preferential terms into wounded giants such as Goldman Sachs, General Electric, and Bank of America. Guy Spear, whose hedge fund has owned Berkshire for more than 20 years, says Buffett has systematically set himself up to be the last man standing. In A Streetcar Named Desire, Blanche DuBois says, "I have always depended on the kindness of strangers." It's a sweet sentiment, except that she's gone mad and is speaking to a doctor who has come to lock her away. In his 2018 letter to shareholders, Buffett added his own twist, pledging, "Charlie and I never will operate Berkshire in a manner that depends on the kindness of strangers, or even that of friends who may be facing liquidity problems of their own. We have intentionally constructed Berkshire in a manner that will allow it to comfortably withstand economic discontinuities, including such extremes as extended market closures. If our goal is financial resilience, It's probably best to clone Buffett, not Blanche. So we need to make sure that we, too, will get along just fine without the kindness of strangers. As a fund manager, EVA couldn't escape from his dependence on others. But individual investors have one significant advantage. They're not answerable to trigger-happy shareholders or any other disgruntled critics, except, perhaps, their own family members. How, then, can individuals reduce their vulnerability and bolster their resilience? Following Buffett's lead, we should always keep enough cash in reserve so we'll never be forced to sell stocks or any other beleaguered asset in a downturn. We should never borrow to excess because, as EVA warns, debt erodes our staying power. Like him, we should avoid the temptation to speculate on hot stocks with supposedly glorious growth prospects, but no margin of safety. And we should bypass businesses with weak balance sheets or a looming need for external funding, which is liable to disappear in times of distress. None of this is brain surgery, but it requires us to take seriously that oft-forgotten commandment, "Thou shalt not depend on the kindness of strangers." The long game. It also helps if we're not in an excessive rush to get rich. In 2014, I asked Irving Kahn to share the most important lessons of his extraordinarily long career. By then, he was 108 years old and had worked on Wall Street since 1928. Nobody in the investment business had survived more turmoil, so I regarded him as the living embodiment of financial and biological resilience. Ivy Kahn was too frail to see me in person. But his grandson Andrew, an analyst at the family's investment firm, Kahn Brothers, read him my questions and wrote down his answers. It turned out that this was Kahn's final interview, as he died just 3 months later at the age of 109. Kahn became Graham's teaching assistant at Columbia in the 1920s, and they remained friends for decades. I wanted to know what he'd learned from Graham that had helped him to prosper during his 86 years in the financial markets. Kahn's answer: investing is about preserving more than anything. That must be your first thought, not looking for large gains. If you achieve only reasonable returns and suffer minimal losses, you will become a wealthy man and will surpass any gambler friends you may have. This is also a good way to cure your sleeping problems. As Kahn put it, the secret of investing could be expressed in one word: safety. And the key to making intelligent investment decisions was always to begin by asking, "How much can I lose?" He explained, considering the downside is the single most important thing an investor must do. This task must be dealt with before any consideration can be made for gains. The problem is that people nowadays think they're pretty smart because they can do something quite rapidly. You can make the horse gallop. But are you on the right path? Can you see where you're going? Kahn's defensive mindset reminds me of the warning that's pounded into the heads of medical students. First, do no harm. For investors, that instruction requires a minor tweak. First, do no self-harm. When we try to explain investment success, we're naturally drawn to racier aspects of the game. It's more fun to tell tales of bold bets that earned billions than to drone on about all of the accidents that never happened. But accident avoidance matters because it's so hard to recover from disaster. Consider the brutal mathematics of financial loss. If you lose 50% on an ill-considered bet, you'll need a 100% gain just to get back to where you started. What made EVA an enduring giant of global investing was that he avoided losses by repeatedly escaping the deadliest dangers in his path. It was a triumph of omission, not commission. Looking back on his career at Sogen and First Eagle, he says, "To the extent that we've been successful over the decades, it's due mostly to what we did not own. We owned no Japanese stocks in the late 80s. We owned no tech in the late 90s. and we didn't own any financial stocks to speak of between 2000 and 2008. His ability to sidestep those three disasters over 3 decades made all the difference between failure and success. Everything fades. EVA retired as a fund manager in 2008 and moved to a senior advisor role at First Eagle. He passed the torch to Matthew McLennan, a 39-year-old Australian who started in the job 1 week before Lehman Brothers went up in smoke and the global financial system began to fall apart. Today, with more than $100 billion in assets and millions of shareholders in his funds, McLennan is one of the world's most influential investors and one of the most thoughtful. At first glance, he could hardly be more different from his predecessor. EVA, with his hangdog facial expression and somber worldview, reminds me of Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh, a melancholy figure who lives in a spot that's marked on the map as Eeyore's gloomy place, rather boggy and sad. McLennan, almost 3 decades younger, exudes bright-eyed enthusiasm and easygoing charm. Almost every sentence he utters is accompanied by a smile. But as investors, EVA and McLennan have much in common. When they first met in 2008, they shared war stories about the tech bubble. McLennan, who had been running a value-oriented global investment portfolio at Goldman Sachs, recounted his own experience of refusing to buy into a mania that offered no margin of safety. EVA approved. He took comfort in the fact that I was willing to be short social acceptance and stand apart from the herd, says McLennan. It's lonely sometimes if you're not part of the fad of the moment. And so we struck a bond. McLennan's unconventional background helps to explain his readiness to take the road less traveled. Born in 1969, he spent the first 6 years of his life in Papua New Guinea, where his father, a surveyor, and mother, a physiotherapist and artist, moved in search of adventure. When I joke that he is Papua's most famous investor, he replies, "Sample size of 1." His parents, whom he describes as free thinkers who felt no need for conventional signs of accumulation, later bought an idyllic piece of land in Australia that was bordered on one side by rainforest. They couldn't obtain permits to connect to the electricity grid, so McLennan spent much of his youth without creature comforts, detached from the normal, literal buzz of existence. The house was full of books, but it didn't have hot running water. So he showered under a tree, using water from a black plastic bag that had been left to warm up in the afternoon sun. They had no refrigerator. Their heating came from a cast-iron stove, which routinely woke him up by smoking him out of the house. We didn't have a television for a long time, he recalls. But then we got one that my father was able to hook up to the car battery. That didn't last very long because, relatively soon after getting it, he reversed out of the driveway with the television still attached to the car battery, dragging it through the front door. McLennan spent much of his time reading, often by the light of a gas lamp. He also hung out with his grandfather, a real thinker who bought stocks, collected wine, cultivated roses, and reminisced about living in Antarctica as a doctor on a geophysical expedition. McLennan inherited his family's passion for intellectual exploration. His conversation is filled with references to great thinkers, from Heraclitus to Thucydides, Montesquieu to Schrödinger. Nothing gives him greater pleasure than the life of the mind. When I have a thought or I'm developing a way of looking at things that rings true, it's the same joy as catching a wave. McLennan's voracious reading led him to the same wary conclusion that Graham and EVA had reached. The future is so intrinsically uncertain that investors should focus heavily on avoiding permanent losses and building a portfolio that can endure various states of the world. As McLennan sees it, we should start by defining our overarching goal, which ought to guide all of our investment choices. He makes the point by quoting the Roman philosopher Seneca, If one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favorable. For McLennan, the destination is clear. Our goal is not to try to become rich quickly. It's resilient wealth creation. For almost all of us, this is a much wiser goal than trying to trounce the market. McLennan's respect for uncertainty stems in part from his study of history. He's particularly fascinated by the relative calm of the early 1900s. He points out that an investor surveying the world in, say, 1908-11, had every reason to feel confident about the future. The global economy had enjoyed a long period of unprecedented growth. Asset values seemed reasonable, and it was widely believed that inflation had been vanquished. Why worry? Then all hell broke loose. The unsinkable Titanic sank on its maiden voyage in 1912, a reminder that man cannot tame nature. An assassination by a Bosnian revolutionary triggered a chain reaction that precipitated the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 4 months during the war, and every major European exchange shut down. The flu pandemic of 1918-19 killed as many as 50 million people. Hyperinflation gripped Germany in 1922, setting the stage for Hitler's rise to power, which began in 1923. The crash of 1929 was followed by the Great Depression. Then World War II struck from 1939 to 1945. Thus, a period of calm prosperity gave way to 3 decades of disaster. Whipsawed by world events, the stock market was ferociously volatile from 1926 to 1945, leaving a generation of investors with a lingering dread of risk. A dangerous blunder that investors repeatedly make is to assume that the period ahead will resemble the period they most recently experienced. But the future can be incredibly different, says McLennan. That next generation had a very different life experience from the prior generation. V.I. Buffett made a similar point after 9/11, which cost Berkshire billions of dollars in insurance losses. Writing to shareholders in 2002, he admitted, "We had either overlooked or dismissed the possibility of large-scale terrorism losses." In short, all of us in the industry made a fundamental underwriting mistake by focusing on experience rather than exposure. With that lesson in mind, McLennan focuses considerable attention on his exposure and on preparing for a future that may look nothing like his recent experience. When we first spoke in his sleek Manhattan offices in the summer of 2017, he listed a litany of threats to which investors were exposed. For example, he pointed out that the United States had even more debt relative to GDP than before the 2008 financial crisis. Interest rates were so low that savers were being penalized for prudence. The rise of automation was fomenting social and political upheaval. The geopolitical backdrop was fraught with the risk of conflict, not least from China's emergence as a rival to the U.S. And a low cost of capital had driven asset prices to exuberant levels, making it hard to find stocks that offered a wide margin of safety. He described these phenomena as forms of fragility and frailty that history shows it's dangerous to ignore. McLennan, who views market predictions as a fool's errand, didn't pretend to know what would come next. However, like Howard Marks, he thinks it's vital to recognize that the pricing of risk goes through enormous cycles. You want to be more willing to commit capital to investments when risk is obviously being well priced, such as late 2008 or 2009. And you want to be more cautious when risk is not being as well priced, like 1999 or 2007, or perhaps today. He likened the situation to living on a fault line in San Francisco. Maybe we have 10 great years ahead of us, and the earthquake doesn't surface. But it would be foolhardy to act as if the threat doesn't exist. We just want to acknowledge that there are things that may not play out so well in the future, he told me. You want to be structured to participate in the march of mankind, but to survive the dips along the way. That's a useful maxim for investing and life. When the threat finally surfaced, it was an epidemic, not an earthquake, that triggered a market collapse in early 2020. Speaking that June from a house in Greenwich, Connecticut, that he'd rented to escape from Manhattan during the pandemic, McLennan remarked that the crash, which struck at a time of complacency, after a decade of almost uninterrupted growth, highlighted his belief that the markets are part of a complex ecosystem that is inherently unpredictable. You know, there was no economist in December of 2019 calling for a COVID disruption to the business cycle. One key to resilience, then, is to ensure that you're prudently positioned when things feel good, since the future is uncertain and can hold events like this. How does McLennan construct a portfolio to achieve his goal of resilient wealth creation? He starts by envisioning the global markets as one giant block of marble. He then begins chipping away every piece that he doesn't want to own, removing whatever promotes fragility in order to sculpt a better outcome. The guiding principle behind this process is one of error elimination. As McLennan explains, there's a fundamental insecurity to this way of thinking. It reflects his recognition that there are lots of things that can harm us, and that resilience requires him to eschew them. McLennan has the flexibility to search anywhere in the world for opportunities, since he manages a global fund and an international fund. Most investors would approach the task by seeking out what he calls heated pockets of thematic growth, fashionable bets such as Brazilian stocks in 2010, social media companies in 2017, or electric cars in 2020. Influenced by their recent experience, investors often load up on whatever has been performing best. But widespread expectations of continued success lead to inflated prices. What's more, areas of high growth ultimately attract fierce competition. As Marx puts it, success carries within it the seeds of failure. If your goal is resilient wealth creation, you can't operate like a heat-seeking missile. The risks are too extreme, because the most popular assets provide no margin of safety. So McLennan begins by chiseling away anything that looks faddish, including countries and sectors that have attracted indiscriminate flows of capital. That habit protected his shareholders when the beloved BRICs, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, stumbled and Brazil blew up. He also avoids countries with political systems that don't respect property rights. That's you, Russia. Likewise, McLennan chips away any company that he believes would add fragility to his portfolio. For example, he avoids business models that are particularly vulnerable to technological change. He's equally averse to companies with opaque balance sheets, too much leverage, or imprudent management that is too expeditionary. That protected him from time bombs such as Enron, Fannie Mae, and all of the banks that imploded during the financial crisis. Instead of assuming that successful businesses will grow in perpetuity, McLennan views them through a darker lens, which he has borrowed from science. I happen to believe that everything is on a path to fade, he says. If you think of evolution, 99% of species that have ever existed are extinct. And businesses are no exception. He regards the economy as an ecology in which the current lords of the jungle will eventually be defeated by disruptive technology and new competitors. Businesses that were robust today won't be robust in the future, says McLennan. Uncertainty is intrinsic to the system. It's entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Basically, things tend toward disorder over time, and it takes a lot of energy to keep structure and quality in place. So philosophically, We have great respect for the fact that things are not structurally permanent in nature, that things fade. This realization has profound implications when it comes to picking stocks. Most investors want to own glamorous companies with heady growth prospects. McLennan focuses instead on a more negative mission of avoiding fade. How? By identifying persistent businesses that are less vulnerable to complex competitive forces. Think of it as an anti-entropy strategy. One example of a business that he expects to persist is FANUC Corp, a Japanese firm that has maintained a remarkably stable position as the world's leading seller of robotics products, such as servomotors. Whatever car you buy in the United States, says McLennan, it's likely that it was painted by a FANUC robot. The company has an entrenched customer base that's used to its products. It gathers real-time data from those clients and harnesses this superior knowledge of the market to keep expanding its lead over competitors. FANUC also benefits from the trend of automation within manufacturing, instead of being a victim of technological change. Its finances are strong, with net cash on the balance sheet, and it's run by a far-sighted management team that speaks explicitly about the priority of positioning the company to survive forever. None of this guarantees that FANUC is immune to entropy, but McLennan believes it's difficult to displace. Another example of a dominant business that he regards as built for resilience is the consumer goods firm Colgate-Palmolive. The company has been selling toothpaste since the 1870s and controls more than 40% of the worldwide market. It's an inexpensive and habitual product that's resistant to disruption, except in the unlikely event that, say, an active ingredient turns out to be carcinogenic. Even in times of economic mayhem, such as 2008 or 2020, it's a business that just tends to grind on, says McLennan. And as with FANUC, that combination of scale and customer captivity tends to produce better margins and therefore more cash flow. This is a company with no novelty or sex appeal. Yet its business model would be so hard to replicate that it possesses what McLennan calls mundane scarcity. There's a counterintuitive elegance to this idea that, when it comes to investing, beauty often lies in mundanity, not glamour. Over the years, he's detected the hidden allure of countless ugly ducklings, from a timberland company acquired during a cyclical downturn to a firm that rents uniforms. Not exactly Tesla. Similarly, as stocks tumbled in March 2020, McLennan added to his stake in a Japanese firm, Hashizaki, another exquisitely mundane and persistent business that he describes as the world leader in ice machines for restaurants. He explains, restaurants always come and go, but they need the same equipment. So the equipment maker is a far safer bet than betting on a restaurant. McLennan also insists that any stock he buys should be priced for fade. In other words, the valuation must be low enough to compensate for his assumption that the company, like every business, is ultimately on a path to irrelevance. He typically seeks to invest at a 30% discount to his estimate of the company's intrinsic value. If the business doesn't fade but instead continues to grow, then we get the growth for free. What remains after McLennan's painstaking process of elimination? A resilient core of unusually persistent, conservatively managed, well-capitalized, undervalued businesses that are likely to thrive even in a Darwinian ecosystem where nothing lives forever. On average, he holds these positions for the best part of a decade, trimming or adding to them as their valuations fluctuate. McLennan recognizes that all of these businesses are imperfect, and some will disappoint. So he adds another layer of resilience by owning about 140 of them. Like Graham and Evia, he sees diversification as a vital component of an error-tolerant strategy that can survive his own mistakes, bad luck, and inability to see the future. VII. Opportunities to buy good businesses at good prices tend to arise erratically, often amid outbreaks of volatility. But McLennan is perfectly happy to wait 5 or 10 years for a desirable company on his watch list to meet his valuation hurdles. In the meantime, he has the discipline to let cash pile up, instead of feeling obliged to invest when prices are too high for comfort. Indeed, the most critical idea he tries to instill in his analysts is the importance of saying no. When markets are ebullient and bargains elude him, McLennan's capacity for saying no becomes positively Evelardian. On February 19, 2020, the day before the COVID crash began, First Eagle Global had only 71% of its assets in stocks, with 15% stashed securely in cash and sovereign debt, a reflection of his concern about high valuations and the brewing risks he described back in 2017. He observes, "It's the fact that we didn't force capital to work at a time when prices weren't conducive to investing that helps us to be resilient in the downdraft." McLennan also held 14% of the fund's assets in gold, which he views as a long-term hedge against market meltdowns, geopolitical chaos, or a loss of confidence in paper money systems. Gold has a negative correlation to stocks in really bad extreme states, he says. It's also one of the scarcest and most resilient elements on the periodic table. It doesn't rust, it doesn't rot, and it doesn't fade like a business or a regime. In a world of man-made instability, he argues, unfashionably, that gold adds natural resilience to his all-weather portfolio, helping to ensure that he can survive those unexpected dips. After all, companies may die, but gold endures. True to form, the global fund held up well amid the tumult of 2020, steadied by its ballast of cash and gold. It's a classic example of the fact that you need to buy the umbrella before it rains, says McLennan. By the time you're hunting around for an umbrella in the middle of a storm, it's pretty difficult to find one. So having the right mindset in advance was critical here. While others panicked, he was also able to invest in battered stocks at prices that were now much more sane. He observes, "It's not enough just to be conservative. You need to be willing to put cash to work when others feel least comfortable doing it." McLennan's resilient approach provides a stark contrast to the behavior of most investors. His systematic focus on removing fragility requires him to avoid all of the obvious behavioral defects they exhibit. For example, they're too impatient to wait for the right purchase price. They rent stocks instead of owning them for years. They succumb to the egotistical delusion that they can predict the future, instead of recognizing the limits of their knowledge. And they leap blindly into manias, their judgment fogged by return envy and the fear of missing out. One book that has influenced his ideas about why people make such self-destructive decisions is The History of the Peloponnesian War, written by the Athenian general Thucydides some 2,400 years ago. McLennan says Athens and Sparta ended up at war because both sides made hasty and hubristic decisions in the passion of the moment. He reasons that the opposite traits, patience and humility, offer a temperamental edge whether we're diffusing a conflict or building wealth. Once again, success stems from consciously resisting everything that promotes fragility. As McLennan describes the process of building a portfolio that can flourish over time, he's reminded of watching his mother gardening while he was growing up in Australia. There was always a problem: dry weather, wilting vines, bug infestations. He often wondered why she bothered to keep going. It would have been so much easier to let the forest grow, or just settle for a lawn that needed mowing once a week. But her care yielded remarkable results over 3 decades. What I saw play out over time was the gradual emergence of this beautiful, beautiful garden that took time. It took selectivity, and I think it's a good metaphor for investing. The first Eagle Global Fund is much like that garden. So much has happened since EVA took charge of the fund in 1979. Bull markets, bubbles, inflation, wars, crashes, crises, and a pandemic. Yet the same disciplined, risk-averse strategy has remained in place throughout. The result? Since 1979, the fund has averaged 12.46% a year versus 9.35% for the MSCI World Index. VIII, if you'd invested $100,000 in the global fund in 1979, it would have grown to $12.94 million in 2020 versus $4.05 million if you'd invested in the index, a difference of almost $9 million. That's the beauty of compounding. Small advantages build over decades into an overwhelming margin of victory. The paradox is that EVA and McLennan hit the ball out of the park without ever swinging for the fences. McLennan attributes their success to a consistent focus on risk mitigation, error elimination, and prudent acts of omission. In essence, it's winning by not losing. Life is not simple. Still, the path to prosperity has not been painless. EVA, now retired, makes no secret of the emotional scars that he carries from the time when his career almost ran off the rails. Looking back on his life, he also regrets that he struggled to balance work and family. His job was so absorbing and sometimes psychologically painful that he neglected his two daughters. Would he have been a less successful stock picker if he'd given them more attention? I don't know, and I'll never know, he says. The Catholic priest was right. Life is not simple. Nonetheless, he feels a deep sense of pride in what he's achieved. What gave me pleasure was not that I did better than others, but that I delivered returns over a long period of time that were vastly in excess of an index fund, he says. It's a game where the numbers don't lie. McLennan, like the rest of us, has also had his share of ups and downs. When I ask how the forces of entropy and impermanence have affected his life, he replies, "Oh, I've experienced it personally. You know, I had a wife. They split up after many years, having had 3 children together. Since then he's fallen in love again, remarried, and had a 4th child, a daughter named Tennyson, like the poet. Both professionally and personally," says McLennan, he has often found that moments of extreme pain were followed by new beginnings and extremely propitious opportunities. For example, the late 90s were a brutal time for value investors such as him and EVA, but the early 2000s were a golden age. So if you were able to endure it, the upside was enormous. In markets, as in life, so much hinges on our ability to survive the dips. McLennan spent 14 years at Goldman Sachs, working with some of the top performers on Wall Street. He initially wondered if the senior brass had some unique talent that set them apart. What I learned over time is that often it was just the people who didn't give up, who just kept learning, kept evolving, stuck to it, and were willing to live through adversity. He sees the same trait among the best investors. They just haven't given up. They're constantly captivated by cracking the code and have the strength to endure the inevitable periods of disappointment. McLennan knows that the future will bring more trouble, more instability, more decay. After all, entropy is the ironclad rule of the universe. But he thinks of himself as an informed realist, not a pessimist. "I'm a believer in human potential, but I think the path is not linear," he says. It's punctured by episodic disruption. So, if you structure your portfolio and your way of thinking to endure those pockets of disruption, you're more likely to be able to benefit from the march of humankind over time than if you depend on it going well. 5 Rules for Resilience. Let's step back for a moment and try to distill a few practical lessons from Graham, Kahn, Buffett, Evia, and McLennan on how to strengthen our resilience as investors. For me, there are 5 fundamental ideas that I can't afford to forget. First, we need to respect uncertainty. Just think of all the turmoil that Graham and Kahn witnessed over the last century or so, and you begin to realize that disorder, chaos, volatility, and surprise are not bugs in the system, but features. We can't predict the timing, triggers, or precise nature of these disruptions, but we need to expect them and prepare for them so we can soften their sting. How? By identifying and consciously removing or reducing our vulnerabilities. As Nassim Nicholas Taleb writes in Antifragile, things that gain from disorder, it is far easier to figure out if something is fragile than to predict the occurrence of an event that may harm it. Second, to achieve resilience, it's imperative to reduce or eliminate debt, avoid leverage, and beware of excessive expenses, all of which can make us dependent on the kindness of strangers. There are 2 critical questions to ask. Where am I fragile? And how can I reduce my fragility? If, say, all of your money is in one bank, one brokerage, one country, one currency, one asset class, or one fund, you may be playing with a loaded gun. With luck, you can get away with anything in the short term. With time, the odds rise that your vulnerability will be exposed by unforeseen events. Third, instead of fixating on short-term gains or beating benchmarks, we should place greater emphasis on becoming shock-resistant, avoiding ruin, and staying in the game. To some degree, the upside will take care of itself as economies grow, productivity improves, populations expand, and compounding works its magic. But as Kahn warned, we can't afford to ignore the downside. Fourth, beware of overconfidence and complacency. Aristotle observed, the character which results from wealth is that of a prosperous fool. Personally, if there's anything I'm sure of, it's that I'm irrational, ignorant, self-deluding, and prone to all of the behavioral mistakes I laugh at in others, including the perilous habit of trusting that the future will resemble the recent past. Fifth, as informed realists, we should be keenly aware of our exposure to risk and should always require a margin of safety. But there's an important caveat. We cannot allow our awareness of risk to make us fearful, pessimistic, or paranoid. Nietzsche warned, stare too long into the abyss and you become the abyss. As McLennan demonstrated during the pandemic, the resilient investor has the strength, confidence, and faith in the future to seize opportunities when unresilient investors are reeling. Defense suddenly turns into offense. Disruption brings profit. Chapter 5, Simplicity, is the ultimate sophistication. A long and winding search for the simplest path to stellar returns. Our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify. Henry David Thoreau. The great paradox of this remarkable age is that the more complex the world around us becomes, the more simplicity we must seek in order to realize our financial goals. Simplicity, indeed, is the master key to financial success. Jack Bogle. The humidity is stifling. On summer days like this, even the hardiest New Yorkers fantasize about escaping from the heat trapped between the city's skyscrapers. Down on Wall Street, the aspiring plutocrats buttoned up in their formal business suits must be gasping for air. 100 miles away, Joel Greenblatt has taken refuge from the city and is working at his beach house in the Hamptons today. We're seated in the shade of his elegantly furnished patio, savoring the cool breeze and his magnificent view of the Atlantic. The house has a swimming pool with a basketball hoop and a lawn with soccer goalposts. A couple of surfboards lean against a wall behind us. Sunlight shimmers on the ocean's surface. Suntanned and relaxed, Greenblatt is dressed in jeans and black leather loafers without socks. His sleeves are rolled up. A keen tennis player, he looks trim and fit on the brink of his 60th birthday. The giants of investing are not always endowed with an abundance of social skills. But Greenblatt, a giant among giants, has a beguiling manner and a warm smile. Above all, there's a quiet confidence and poise about him, a sense that he is beyond the usual craving for approval. He's comfortable with who he is, secure in the knowledge of all that he's achieved. Perhaps that's not surprising, given the extent of his accomplishments. Greenblatt's investment returns are the stuff of legend. In 1985, at the tender age of 27, he founded Gotham Capital and launched a hedge fund with assets of about $7 million. In 1989, he was joined by Robert Goldstein, who remains his partner 3 decades later. In its first 10 years, the fund scored returns of 50% a year, after expenses but before fees. Over 20 years, it averaged an astonishing 40% a year. At that rate, $1 million grows to $836 million, a nifty trick. After 5 years, Gotham returned half of its investors' money. After 10, it returned the rest, so that Greenblatt and Goldstein could concentrate on managing their own fortunes. Most fund managers are vulnerable to their shareholders' whims. But they had the ultimate luxury of being answerable to nobody. Free to pursue his curiosity wherever it took him, Greenblatt forged an unpredictable path. Many of the best investors have narrow interests, since excellence demands focus. But Greenblatt has led a rich and varied life. For a start, he's an enthusiastic family man with a wife, 5 kids, and 2 dogs. He's also an annoyingly talented writer. He's published 3 investment books, which are filled with his unique blend of granular advice, irreverent wisecracks. Note, there are 3 kinds of people, those who can count and those who can't. Exuberant wordplay ipso facto is spelled ipso fatso, and amusing tales of his youthful misadventures involving imitation dog vomit and underage bets at the Greyhound racetrack. His first book, You Can Be a Stock Market Genius, Even If You're Not Too Smart, was intended for a general audience, but became a Bible for hedge fund managers in search of an edge. His second, The Little Book That Beats the Market, was designed to demystify investing for his children, but sold more than 300,000 copies and was hailed by Michael Price as one of the most important investment books of the last 50 years. His third book, The Big Secret for the Small Investor, fared less well. Greenblatt jokes that it's still a secret because no one read it. Since 1996, he has also taught the course Value and Special Situation Investment at Columbia Business School. So far, he's instructed an elite cohort of around 800 MBA students, sharing with them the intellectual framework that enabled him to beat the market. Greenblatt begins the course by informing them that the skills he's about to teach can make them extremely rich, but he warns that this pursuit has about as much social value as a knack for handicapping horses. With that caveat in mind, he asks them to find some way to give back. Writing and teaching have provided Greenblatt with 2 rewarding ways of giving back. In a field that's rife with self-serving and misguided advice that may be hazardous to your financial health, he has followed in the grand tradition of Ben Graham, Warren Buffett, and Howard Marks by sharing investment wisdom that has demonstrably worked. Meanwhile, as a philanthropist, Greenblatt has also played an instrumental role in creating a network of 45 free public charter schools that serve 18,000 students across New York City. Most come from low-income and minority households in areas such as the Bronx and Harlem. In recent years, Greenblatt has also returned to managing outside money. He and Goldstein have created a family of long-short mutual funds, which represent an intriguing and unexpected departure from the strategy that propelled them to stardom. Greenblatt, who has a strong entrepreneurial streak, loves starting new ventures. But his underlying ambition isn't to maximize his own wealth by building a financial empire. "I have nothing against making money," he says, "but it's not really what drives me. I have enough." Rather, he's motivated primarily by a game player's delight in devising ingenious ways to win. "It's the fun of the challenge of figuring things out that I'm most attracted to," he says. "And since everyone else in the world is trying to figure it out, it's a nice feeling to solve the puzzle." Indeed, I see Greenblatt as a kind of code breaker, who is drawn inexorably to the intellectual challenge of beating the system. I wanted to understand what he had discovered in more than 3 decades of attempting to decrypt the market and outwit the competition. As I would soon learn, the principles underpinning his strategies are surprisingly simple. In fact, what makes Greenblatt such an illuminating guide to investing is his gift for reducing this complex game to its purest essence. For example, during a conversation at his office in Midtown Manhattan, he tells me that the entire secret of successful stock picking comes down to this: figure out what something is worth and pay a lot less. Is it really that straightforward? Well, we shall see. But first, let's take a brief detour to explain why it's so important to identify a few fundamental principles that are, at least, approximately true. Then, with help from Greenblatt and some other financial titans, we'll narrow everything down to a handful of specific investment principles that should help us to stay on track for decades to come. The goal. In this overcomplicated world of ours, we are searching for a simple, logical, and dependable path to superior returns. The simplicity that lies on the other side of complexity. Growing up in London in the 1970s, I could choose from a grand total of 3 television channels. I still remember the magical evening in 1982 when my motherland was blessed by the miraculous arrival of Channel 4, which promised to deliver a limitless feast of televisual wonders. Nowadays, in 21st century New York, I have at least 100 channels. Yet I can seldom be bothered to switch on my TV, except for the reliable disappointment of watching England's soccer team getting knocked out of the World Cup every 4 years. We often assume that additional choices will make us happier. Up to a point, it may even be true. But I'm hardly alone in finding all of this added complexity overwhelming. The psychologist Barry Schwartz argues in The Paradox of Choice, why more is less, that many shoppers become paralyzed by the first world problem of supermarket shelves heaving under the weight of 24 types of gourmet jam. When it comes to investing, the proliferation of choices can make your head spin. Should you buy individual stocks, ETFs, hedge funds, or mutual funds? Actively managed funds or index funds? Should you favor one investment style or mix and match among such categories as growth, value, growth at a reasonable price, deep value, momentum, macro, or market neutral? And how should you divide your money between domestic and foreign stocks, bonds, cash, and alternatives, such as private equity, venture capital, REITs, gold, and pork belly futures? In practical terms, the ability to reduce complexity is immensely valuable. Just think for a moment about the Old Testament, which contains no fewer than 613 commandments. Who can remember so many rules, let alone obey them all? Maybe that's why we needed a top 10 list. But when I tried to jot down the 10 commandments just now, I got only 6 of them right, and that was with the assistance of some dishonest grading. Still, I do remember this. About 2,000 years ago, a sage named Hillel was asked to teach the entire Old Testament while standing on one leg. He replied, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." All the rest is commentary. The Old Testament requires just 3 words to convey this overriding rule. V'havta l'recha kamacha, which is translated from the Hebrew as, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Likewise, when Jesus was asked about the most important of all the commandments, he opted for deep simplicity, declaring, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. I'm also partial to this wonderfully concise exhortation from the Buddha. Refrain from what is unwholesome. Do good. Purify the mind. As an instruction manual for life, how much more do we need than those 10 words? Like Hillel and Jesus, the Buddha presumably recognized that we lesser mortals are acutely vulnerable to confusion in the face of complexity, and that a minimal number of simple, memorable guideposts can steer us pretty effectively in the general direction of nirvana. Simplification is an equally important strategy in more worldly realms such as science and business. For example, scientists often invoke the Occam's razor principle, which is attributed to a 14th century English friar and philosopher named William of Ockham. His principle holds that, all things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. Occam's image of a razor captures the critical notion that we're more likely to find the right answer by shaving away all unnecessary details. Albert Einstein agreed, observing, all physical theories, their mathematical expressions apart, ought to lend themselves to so simple a description that even a child could understand them. Lord Ernest Rutherford, the father of nuclear physics, reached a similar conclusion, reputedly remarking, if a piece of physics cannot be explained to a barmaid, then it is not a good piece of physics. Aye aye. Simplicity also plays an important role in many of the most successful businesses. Take the Google home page, which consists primarily of a logo and a pill-shaped space in which to type your search words. Or consider the sleek, uncluttered elegance that Steve Jobs, inspired by the minimalist aesthetic of Zen Buddhism, brought to Apple's products. As Jobs often explained, his devotion to simplicity went far beyond design. The way we're running the company, the product design, the advertising, it all comes down to this. Let's make it simple. Really simple. As far back as 1977, the company's first marketing brochure featured a photograph of a shiny red apple under the tagline "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." Aye aye aye. The financial services industry tends not to favor simplicity, hence the rise of mind-boggling innovations, such as collateralized debt obligations, structured investment vehicles, and credit default swaps, which came close to destroying the global economy in 2008. The late Jack Bogle, who founded the Vanguard Group in 1975 and created the first index fund a year later, observed in a book titled Enough, financial institutions operate by a kind of reverse Occam's razor. They have a large incentive to favor the complex and costly over the simple and cheap, quite the opposite of what most investors need and ought to want. When I interviewed Bogle in 2001, he pointed out that nothing could have been simpler than his theory that low-cost index funds would beat actively managed funds as a group, since the latter would be burdened by higher operating expenses and transaction costs. When there's a financial intermediary, a croupier, it takes a lot out of the market return, he told me. So index funds have to win. It was not complicated. That elementary insight into the mathematical advantages of index funds proved so powerful that Vanguard's assets have since grown to $6.2 trillion. One of the most thoughtful proponents of simplicity is Josh Waitzkin, an expert on peak performance in fields as diverse as chess, martial arts, and investing. As a child prodigy, he was a national chess champion and the subject of the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. As an adult, He became a world champion in Tai Chi and push hands, a coach to hedge fund managers, and the author of a fascinating book, The Art of Learning, an inner journey to optimal performance. Based on his own experience as a world-class performer, Waitskin stresses the importance of breaking down complicated challenges into simple components. When teaching chess, he would remove all but 3 pieces, 2 kings and 1 pawn, as a way of exploring the game's essential principles in a context of reduced complexity. Similarly, he mastered Tai Chi by incrementally refining the simplest of movements, for example pushing your hands 6 inches through the air. By obsessively practicing such simplified motions, he gradually internalized the underlying principles of the entire martial art, such as the coordination of mind, breath, and body. He concludes, "It is rarely a mysterious technique that drives us to the top, but rather a profound mastery of what may well be a basic skill set." This is a crucial insight that can benefit even the smartest investors. After all, complexity can be a particularly seductive trap for clever people. They were rewarded at school for solving complex problems, so it's no surprise if they are drawn to complicated solutions when confronted by the puzzle of investing. But in financial markets, as in martial arts, victory doesn't depend on dazzling displays of esoteric techniques. It depends on a firm grasp of the principles of the game and a deep mastery of basic skills. As Buffett has said, business schools reward difficult, complex behavior more than simple behavior. But simple behavior is more effective. Buffett himself is a grand master of simplification. Writing to his shareholders in 1977, he laid out his 4 criteria for selecting any stock. "We want the business to be 1 that we can understand, 2 with favorable long-term prospects, 3 operated by honest and competent people, and 4 available at a very attractive price." These may not strike you as earth-shattering secrets, but it's hard to beat this distillation of eternal truths about what makes a stock desirable. More than 40 years have passed, yet Buffett's 4 filters remain as relevant and useful as ever. I've been struck again and again by the ability of the best investors to condense many years of learning into a few key principles. This isn't a matter of dumbing things down or pretending that complications and contradictions don't exist. It's about synthesizing the details of an endlessly rich and nuanced subject, then crunching it down into an irreducible essence. This reminds me of a remark that's often attributed to the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. "For the simplicity that lies this side of complexity, I would not give a fig, but for the simplicity that lies on the other side of complexity, I would give my life." VI. Why is it so valuable to reduce investing to a few core principles? For a start, it forces us to think through what we truly believe. These convictions are especially useful in tempestuous times, when we're barraged by uncertainty, doubt, and fear. Just think how disoriented we felt in the early months of 2020, when COVID-19 killed more than 100,000 people in the United States alone, threw tens of millions into unemployment, and drove the market down by a third in a matter of weeks. But it's almost as easy to get knocked off course in the best of times. There's so much anxiety-inducing noise in the news, so many competing sales pitches from hawkers of awful investment products and dubious expertise, so many temptations to switch to whatever fashionable strategy or overheated asset class seems to be making everyone else ludicrously rich. The best investors have the discipline not to be swayed by such distractions. As Greenblatt says, "I have a simple way of looking at things that makes sense to me and that I'm going to stick with through thick and thin." That's it. Willdanoff's secret sauce. The virtues of a simple, deeply held investment credo struck me with particular force when I interviewed Will Danoff at the Boston headquarters of Fidelity Investments. There's nothing slick or showy about Danoff, a genial workaholic with a gap-toothed grin and a wry sense of humor. He looks more like a rumpled, sleep-deprived middle manager than a master of the universe. Still, since taking charge of the Fidelity Contra Fund in 1990, he has built it into a colossus with about $118 billion in assets, making it America's largest actively managed fund run by a single person. In all, he manages more than $200 billion. It's notoriously difficult to outperform the market with a huge fund. But when we met in 2017, Danoff had the remarkable distinction of having whipped the S&P 500 over 1, 3, 5, 10, and 27 years. I was eager to uncover the subtle ingredient of his secret sauce. But he managed to sum up his entire investment philosophy in 3 words: stocks follow earnings. With that principle in mind, he searches with relentless drive for best-of-breed businesses that he thinks will grow to be bigger in 5 years. Why? Because if a company doubles its earnings per share in the next 5 years, he believes the stock price is also likely to double, more or less. This generalization is easy to dismiss because it sounds suspiciously simplistic. But remember, investing isn't like Olympic diving, where the judges award extra points for difficulty. Danoff is unapologetic about his single-minded focus on predicting earnings growth. Unlike most of the investors in this book, he doesn't even worry that much about valuation levels, except when they get ridiculous. He asks, do you want to win the game for shareholders and own great companies? Sometimes to own a great company, you've got to pay a fair price. This mindset has led him to amass enormous, long-held positions in dominant, well-managed businesses such as Berkshire Hathaway, a major holding since 1996, Microsoft, Alphabet. He was one of the largest investors in Google's 2004 IPO and has held it ever since. Amazon, his biggest position, and Facebook, he was among the biggest buyers in the IPO. This is pretty basic stuff, he says. My attitude with investing is, why not invest with the best? To explain his way of thinking, Danoff shows me a stack of tattered and coffee-stained notes that provide a partial record of his meetings with tens of thousands of companies over the past 3 decades. He pulls out one of his favorite mementos, 2 pages of his messy, handwritten scribblings from a meeting with Howard Schultz, the visionary who transformed Starbucks into a global brand. They met in June 1992, exactly 1 week before the company went public with a market value of $250 million. These days, Starbucks is valued at about $120 billion. Looking over his notes from that meeting, Danoff tells me, everything you needed to know was laid out here. There was a huge opportunity. For example, Schultz pointed out that Italy alone had at least 200,000 coffee bars. By comparison, Starbucks had 139. But the Seattle-based company was aggressively expanding into other cities, opening new cafes at a modest cost of about $250,000 apiece. In its 3rd year, a cafe could generate $150,000 in profits, a 60% return on the initial investment. The key, says Danoff, is that the return on each store was quite high, so the company could grow at a fast pace without needing external financing. Danoff says he didn't appreciate Schultz when they first met. But Starbucks would ultimately become one of the Contra Fund's largest holdings. Along the way, the company would provide the perfect illustration of why it's so valuable to invest for the long run in great businesses that sustain an unusually high growth rate. Danoff points to a chart that tracks the company's stupendous performance over 2 decades. Its earnings per share grew by 27.45% annually for 20 years, while the stock soared by 21.32% a year. Over the same period, The S&P 500's earnings grew by 8.4% a year, while the index rose just 7.9% a year. Danoff runs a finger along the fever lines on his chart and asks me what lesson they demonstrate. I reply, the stock price is eventually going to follow the earnings. His eyes open wide and he flashes me a joyous smile. Exactly. Bingo. That's what I've learned. Stocks follow earnings. His mantra doesn't sound particularly profound. But Danoff's edge lies partly in his consistent refusal to overcomplicate. His friend Bill Miller, one of the most insightful thinkers in investing, says Danoff consciously focuses on the questions that matter most instead of getting tangled up in distracting details. Will once said to me, falsely, "Look, I'm not that smart and there's a lot of information out there. So when I look at a company, I just ask myself, are things getting better or are they getting worse? If they're getting better, then I want to understand what's going on." Yeah. Miller, too, has learned to simplify his investment process. "I'm trying to get rid of the unnecessary parts of what I used to do," he says. For example, he used to build elaborate financial models in an attempt to grasp the complexities of each company he was analyzing. "I don't build models anymore. It's just stupid. It doesn't make any sense." Instead, he concentrates on 3 or 4 critical issues that he believes will drive the business. "For every company, there are a few key investment variables," he says, "and the rest of the stuff is noise." The pattern is clear. In their own ways, Greenblatt, Buffett, Bogle, Danoff, and Miller have all been seekers of simplicity. The rest of us should follow suit. We each need a simple and consistent investment strategy that works well over time, one that we understand and believe in strongly enough that we'll adhere to it faithfully through good times and bad. We'll return to this idea later because it's so important. But for now, let's delve deeper into Greenblatt's mind and find out what he figured out about how to solve the puzzle of investing. Efficient markets, crazy people, and dynamite. When Greenblatt was an undergraduate at Wharton in the late 1970s, his professors insisted that there was no point even trying to beat the market. As proponents of the efficient market theory, they claimed that stock prices incorporate all of the information that's publicly available. As they saw it, the interaction between knowledgeable buyers and sellers results in stocks being priced efficiently at their fair value, which means that it's futile to hunt for bargains. Intellectually, it's an elegant theory, a testament to the collective wisdom of crowds. What's more, it's had the positive effect of drawing many regular investors into index funds. They are built upon the disheartening but realistic notion that, if you can't beat the market, you should focus on matching its returns at the lowest possible cost. For the vast majority of investors, indexing is the most rational and simplest strategy of all. But Greenblatt didn't buy what he was being taught. "I had a visceral response to what I was learning about efficient markets," he says. "It didn't seem to make sense to me just on a basic level of looking at the newspaper and seeing what was happening." For a start, he could see that stocks routinely experience wild swings between their 52-week highs and lows. If a stock trades at $50 in February and shoots up to $90 in November, how could it be correctly priced at both extremes? And what about hot stocks, such as the Nifty 50, that suddenly burst into flames? For example, did the purportedly all-knowing crowd price Polaroid fairly at $150 in 1972 and at $14 in 1974? It seemed highly unlikely. Greenblatt saw that the overall market also lurches erratically from one extreme to another. The euphoric boom and sickening bust of 1972-74 established a pattern of head-wrenching volatility that he would observe throughout his career. He points out that the S&P 500 doubled from 1996 to 2000, halved from 2000 to 2002, doubled from 2002 to 2007, halved from 2007 to 2009, and tripled from 2009 to 2017. Were investors logically and efficiently setting stock prices as the market soared, stumbled, and swooned? Or were they much less rational than the academic theorists wanted to believe? Greenblatt graduated summa cum laude in 1979 and enrolled in Wharton's MBA program. But his formal education did little to resolve these market mysteries. He took a class on investment management, but failed to find enlightenment in abstruse topics such as quadratic parametric programming. He did achieve one distinction. I was able to get the lowest grade in the class. Greenblatt was saved by Forbes. In his junior year at Wharton, he had chanced upon a short article about Ben Graham's strategy for identifying bargain stocks. That led him to read Security Analysis and The Intelligent Investor, which he describes as the antithesis of what I was learning at school. Graham's perspective on how the market works was so simple and clear, says Greenblatt, that it got me very excited. Above all, Graham taught him one life-changing lesson. As Greenblatt puts it, stocks are ownership shares of businesses, which you're valuing and trying to buy at a discount. The key, then, is to identify situations in which there's a particularly large spread between the price and the value of the business. That spread gives you a margin of safety, which Greenblatt, like Graham and Buffett, regards as the single most important concept in investing. Once you realize that your entire mission is to value businesses and pay much less for them than they're worth, it's incredibly liberating. If you see it that simply and can keep that simplicity in your mind, it's very compelling and almost makes a lot of what else you see look silly, says Greenblatt. It kind of gets rid of 99% of everything else that anyone had ever told me about how to look at the world and the market. Many investors get rattled when they read the latest news about, say, a Greek debt crisis that threatens the European economy. But Greenblatt says, the way I look at it is, if I own a chain store in the Midwest, am I all of a sudden going to sell it for half of what it's worth because something bad happened in Greece? I don't think so. But that's what you read in the newspaper, and that's what everyone is looking at. If you have a context to say, well, does it matter or doesn't it matter, it's just very helpful. Indeed, you start to realize that much of the investment world is engaged in fruitless nonsense. Wall Street economists and market strategists pontificate about macroeconomic headwinds and tailwinds that nobody can reliably or consistently predict. Media pundits muse about the significance of short-term price fluctuations that are random and meaningless. Highly intelligent analysts at brokerage firms squander their time calculating next quarter's corporate earnings to the exact penny, an absurd guessing game that's irrelevant to successful, long-term investors. Not to be outdone, academics teach complicated mathematical formulas and speak in a private code about Sharpe ratios, Sortino ratios, alpha, beta, the Modigliani measure, and other arcane concepts that lend an air of scientific exactitude to the messiness of the markets. Meanwhile, investment consultants harness these highfalutin notions to convince clients that their portfolios need frequent, subtle fine-tuning. Buffett has derided these high-priced peddlers of complexity as hyper-helpers, whose advice is often delivered in esoteric gibberish. By contrast, Graham wrote simply and clearly about Mr. Market. He encapsulated the entire game of investing in one brief parable about this muddle-headed character. In The Intelligent Investor, Graham suggests imagining that you own a $1,000 stake in a private business. Every day your partner, the obliging but irrational Mr. Market, provides you with a valuation of that stake. His price quote changes based on how enthusiastic or fearful he feels that day. You may be happy to sell out to him when he quotes you a ridiculously high price, and equally happy to buy from him when his price is low. The rest of the time you can sit on your hands, waiting for Mr. Market to lose his mind once more, and offer you another deal that you can't refuse. In other words, the market isn't an efficient machine that reliably and consistently sets fair prices. It's a comedy of errors, a festival of folly. People are crazy and emotional, says Greenblatt. They buy and sell things in an emotional way, not in a logical way, and that's the only reason why we have any opportunity. So if you have a way to value businesses that's disciplined and makes sense, you should be able to take advantage of other people's emotions. This raises an obvious but crucial question. Do you know how to value a business? There's nothing admirable or shameful about your response. But you and I need to answer this question honestly, since self-delusion is a costly habit in extreme sports such as skydiving and stock picking. It's a very small fraction of people that can value businesses, and if you can't do that, I don't think you should be investing on your own, says Greenblatt. How can you invest intelligently if you can't figure out what something is worth? Romans 7, he adds that most people should just index because they don't understand what they're doing. I don't have the technical skills, patience, or interest to value businesses. So it makes sense for me to outsource the job to professionals who are better equipped for the task. This self-restraint should save me a lot of pain. As Greenblatt observes in the little book that beats the market, choosing individual stocks without any idea of what you're looking for is like running through a dynamite factory with a burning match. You may live, but you're still an idiot. Every few years, I ignore this warning and buy an individual stock, despite my better judgment. I currently own 3 stocks. One is Berkshire Hathaway, which I expect to hold for many years. I'd like to think that I understand the business well enough to justify this long-term investment. Less defensively, I also own a tiny stake in a mining and property company recommended to me by a well-known investor who shall remain nameless. How has it done? So far, it's down 87%. For now, I'm keeping it as a painful reminder to be more careful around lit matches and dynamite. Stock number 3 is Seritage Growth Properties, a contrarian investment that I cloned from Monish Pabrai when the retail real estate sector crashed in 2020. Depending on the business, Greenblatt uses some combination of 4 standard valuation techniques. Method 1. He performs a discounted cash flow analysis, calculating the net present value of the company's estimated future earnings. Method 2. He assesses the company's relative value, comparing it to the price of similar businesses. Method 3. He estimates the company's acquisition value, figuring out what an informed buyer might pay for it. Method 4. He calculates the company's liquidation value, analyzing what it would be worth if it closed and sold its assets. None of these methods is precise, and each has its limitations. But Greenblatt works on the basis that, if a stock is sufficiently cheap, the upside potential significantly outweighs the downside. The underlying concept of buying bargains is simplicity itself. But the execution process is that simple because it involves such complexities as, roughly, predicting a company's future earnings and cash flows. This reminds me of an acerbic comment about investing that Charlie Munger once made at the end of a lunch with Howard Marks. It's not supposed to be easy. Anyone who thinks it's easy is stupid. Greenblatt insists that his own valuation skills are merely average. Rather, his advantage stems chiefly from his ability to contextualize everything he sees in the market, fitting it all into a coherent framework. His faith in this framework is so strong that he issues a guarantee to his Columbia students. If they do a decent job of valuing businesses, buy them at a steep discount to their intrinsic value, and wait patiently for the gap to close between the current price and their appraisal of the value, the market will eventually reward them. VIII. The hitch is that you can never tell how long the process of convergence between price and value will take. Still, he says, I'm a firm believer that, in 90% of the cases, the market will recognize that value within 2 or 3 years. This points to a fundamental truth that is one of the most dependable laws of the financial universe. In the short term, the market is irrational and frequently misprices stocks, but in the long term, it's surprisingly rational. Eventually, says Greenblatt, Mr. Market gets it right. Unfair bets and ugly ducklings. After leaving Wharton, Greenblatt headed to Stanford Law School, mostly to avoid getting an actual job. He dropped out after a year. Many of his peers followed well-trodden paths to become corporate lawyers or investment bankers. But he didn't fancy toiling for 100 hours a week at a vast, faceless corporation in the pursuit of a conventional career. Ultimately, he wanted to find an enjoyable way to get paid for smart ideas, rather than punching a clock. In the meantime, he took a summer job at Bear Stearns, where he fell into a relatively new field, options trading. He recalls, I was executing riskless arbitrage trades by literally running across the trading floor, getting a printout from the one printer, running back to my desk, and scouring the printout to look for anomalies that I could trade. By using put and call options, he could lock in automatic profits with no risk of loss. It opened me up to what was possible on Wall Street. Greenblatt had always been fascinated by gambling. At 15, he discovered the furtive joy of sneaking into a dog track and wagering a couple of bucks on a greyhound. His brain was built for betting. I like calculating the odds, he says. Consciously or unconsciously, I'm calculating the odds on every investment. What's the upside? What's the downside? When I mention that all of the best investors seem to think probabilistically, carefully weighing the odds of different outcomes, he replies, I don't think you can be a good investor without thinking in that way. Greenblatt spent the next 3 years as an analyst at a startup investment firm, making risk arbitrage bets on companies involved in mergers. It didn't take him long to realize that this was a game with odious odds. If a merger went ahead as planned, you could make $1 or $2, he says. But if the deal unexpectedly fell apart, you could lose 10 or 20. This was the exact opposite of Graham's strategy of buying dirt cheap stocks, where you can lose $1 or $2 and make 10 or 20. That's a good risk-reward. In 1985, Greenblatt launched Gotham Capital with the intention of applying the principles he had learned from Graham. Greenblatt started with $7 million in capital, most of it supplied by Michael Milken, the king of junk bonds, whom he'd met through a classmate from Wharton. Milken reputedly earned more than $1 billion in 4 years at Drexel Burnham Lambert, so a little side bet on a promising but unproven 27-year-old wasn't much of a risk. IX. Greenblatt says his investment strategy at Gotham involved making money not from taking risk, but from making unfair bets. That's to say, he invested only when the odds seemed to favor him overwhelmingly. The details changed from one investment to the next, but he always sought asymmetric propositions where I can't lose much and maybe I'll make a lot. He quips, if you don't lose money, most of the other alternatives are good. Unfair bets are rare, but Greenblatt didn't need that many. He typically had 80% of his fund riding on 6 to 8 investments, an extraordinary level of concentration. There aren't that many great opportunities, he explains. I was looking for low hurdles, things that other people would have bought too if they'd done the work. Building on his experience in risk arbitrage, he developed an expertise in special situations that most investors overlooked, including corporate spin-offs, restructurings, and orphan equities that were emerging from bankruptcy. He also invested in small stocks with liquidity constraints, since most institutional investors were too big to buy them. He remarks, "It's easier to find bargains off the beaten path or in extraordinary situations that other people aren't looking at." Greenblatt had the latitude to prospect in these offbeat places because he never let his fund become bloated. "We could have raised whatever amount we wanted, but you lower your returns," he says. In 1994, when Gotham's assets reached about $300 million, he returned all of the outside capital. As a result, the fund remained nimble enough to venture anywhere. Indeed, when I ask him to explain Gotham's success, the first factor he cites is that we remained small. The second is that his portfolio was exceptionally concentrated, so you only have to find a few ideas. The third, we got a little lucky. Over the years, he explains, Gotham suffered remarkably few disasters, which he attributes partly to good fortune. "I also hated losing money," he adds. "So we really put the bar very high before we would buy anything." Greenblatt's ultra-selective strategy meant that he routinely rejected stocks that looked good, not great. Likewise, if it was too difficult to value a particular business, he walked away. "I want to keep it easy for myself," he says. "Maybe I'm a little lazier than most people. Or at least, I'm trying to pursue things that are 1-foot hurdles rather than 10-foot hurdles." But on those rare occasions when the market delivered a fat pitch right in his sweet spot, he didn't hesitate to whack it with all his might. One of these precious gifts from the financial gods arrived in 1993, a dream investment, says Greenblatt, that had pretty much everything in it. It all began with the announcement in October 1992 that the Marriott Corporation would split in two. The company had landed itself in trouble during a real estate downturn, says Greenblatt, and got caught with a pile of hotels that they had built and now couldn't sell. Stephen Bollenbach, a financial wizard who had just restructured Donald Trump's collapsing casino and hotel empire, parachuted into Marriott to perform another corporate rescue mission. Marriott had two businesses, a beautiful swan and an ugly duckling. The beautiful business generated a rich and predictable fee stream by managing hotels for other companies. The ugly business, which built and owned hotels, was overloaded with debt. Bollenbach prescribed a drastic surgical procedure to separate the two businesses. The beautiful part would be carved off into a new company, Marriott International. About 85% of the Marriott Corporation's value would be neatly repackaged in this pristine, debt-free spin-off. Meanwhile, the unsellable hotels and about $2.5 billion in debt would be dumped into a second company, Host Marriott, a nasty little cast-off that would apparently consist of all the toxic waste that no one wanted to own. The beautiful swan, Marriott International, would be free to swim off into the sunset, leaving the ugly duckling, Host Marriott, to drown. Or so it seemed. Greenblatt knew that almost nobody would bother to analyze Host Marriott, let alone invest in it. "It just looked horrible," he says. "It had a lot of debt. It was in a bad business. There was nothing good about it. Moreover, it was too tiny for most institutional investors to hold, even if they could tolerate the stench." Existing shareholders of the Marriott Corporation would receive stock in Host Marriott when the spin-off was completed. But Greenblatt was sure they would sell in droves. So what did he do? He zeroed in on the ugly duckling. "The way you're going to find bargains," he says, "is by searching for hidden value in assets that other people don't want." One clue that Host Marriott might not be as rotten as it looked was that Bollenbach, the guy who designed this evil plan, was going to run it. Why would this canny moneymaker want to take charge of the business if it was truly destined for bankruptcy? It turned out that he was well incentivized to turn the firm around. For good measure, the Marriott family would also own 25% of Host Marriott. So some savvy insider had a powerful interest in its success. Greenblatt studied the company in depth and discovered a surprising amount of value. Sure, there was plenty of lousy real estate, including some unfinished hotels. But there were also some valuable assets, such as airport restaurant concessions and several debt-free properties. Best of all, the stock was fabulously cheap at around $4 per share. His best guess was that the debt-free assets alone were worth $6 per share. But there was also a debt-laden subsidiary that might be valuable too, if its fortunes ever improved. The asymmetry was so amazing, he says. I was buying $6 worth of assets with no debt on it for $4, plus I had the upside on the other pile of assets. If the subsidiary was worth nothing, then I just paid $4 for something worth $6. So Greenblatt loaded up, staking almost 40% of his fund's assets on Host Marriott. It was a breathtakingly bold move. Here was a struggling business that was leveraged to the hilt. Yet Greenblatt saw what everyone else missed, an irresistibly unfair bet. As Graham had taught him, what mattered most was the margin of safety. If you bought a stock for much less than its intrinsic value, other investors would figure it out sooner or later and drive up the price. In the meantime, says Greenblatt, I didn't see how I was going to lose much money. That's precisely why he made such an aggressive bet. You size your positions based on how much risk you're taking, he says. I don't buy more of the ones I can make the most money on. I buy more of the ones that I can't lose money on. So what happened? In the fall of 1993, Host Marriott began trading as an independent company. Within 4 months, Greenblatt tripled his money as this ugly duckling defied its doubters and took flight. Greenblatt had never expected the wager to work out so quickly. That was luck, he says. But we set ourselves up to get lucky. Now, before I get too carried away, I'll admit that the execution of this investment was not that simple. For a start, Greenblatt bought preferred shares, which would have given him an extra measure of protection if the company had gone bust. He also used call options to structure his bet. What's more, it required a rare combination of cold rationality, independence of mind, and sheer guts to stake so much on a widely reviled business. Still, the underlying principle could not have been simpler. Remember, figure out what something is worth and pay a lot less. Cheap plus good equals the Holy Grail. Greenblatt's investment approach continued to evolve, partly because he saw how Buffett had updated and improved Graham's strategy of buying undervalued stocks. As Greenblatt explains, Buffett added one little simple twist, which made him one of the richest people in the world. Buying cheap is great, and if I can buy good businesses cheap, even better. In his early days, Buffett had made a fortune trading in and out of mediocre companies that he bought at a deep discount. But as his assets ballooned, he needed a more scalable strategy. Under Munger's influence, Buffett shifted to buying what he described as wonderful businesses at fair prices and holding them indefinitely. In 1988, Berkshire invested $650 million in Coca-Cola, paying what seemed to be an exorbitant price. On the contrary, it proved to be a steal. Why? Because it was an exceptional growth machine with a sustainable competitive advantage and high returns on invested capital. Berkshire ended up making 10 times its money in 12 years. By studying Buffett, Greenblatt gained a clearer sense of what constitutes a wonderful business. A prime specimen presented itself in 2000 with the spin-off of Moody's Corporation, a credit trading agency that had been part of Dun and Bradstreet. Moody didn't appear on its face to be cheaply priced, says Greenblatt. But in a perfect example of cloning, he and Goldstein reverse-engineered Buffett's Coca-Cola purchase to figure out whether Moody's might also be worth a premium price. They concluded that it was possibly the best business they'd ever seen. Moody's was one of two dominant players in a lucrative niche with high barriers to entry. Its revenues had grown by 15% a year for almost 2 decades. And while Coke boasted impressive returns on capital, Moody's could keep growing at a healthy clip with no capital investment, other than paying for a few desks and computers. Greenblatt assumed conservatively that its earnings could continue to grow by 12% a year for a decade. The trouble was, the stock traded at a rich multiple of 21 times next year's earnings. But when he considered what Buffett had paid for Coke, he realized that Moody's was still pretty darn cheap. Who else recognized this bargain in disguise? Buffett. He bought 15% of Moody's and still owns much of his stake 2 decades later. By 2020, shares that he originally bought for $248 million were worth almost $6 billion. By contrast, Greenblatt took a handsome profit and redeployed his money in cheaper stocks. Pretty much everything we ever owned, we sold way too early, he says. If you're very cheap in buying, it's hard to be as comfortable when something has doubled or tripled, even if it's still good. As a professor and a writer, Greenblatt kept pushing himself to articulate more clearly what he'd figured out about how to invest. This process was incredibly helpful to me in trying to boil down in a very simple way exactly what I had been trying to do, he says. It boiled down simpler and simpler. And what he came to realize is that it all boiled down to this: buy good businesses at bargain prices. This combines the purified essence of Graham and Buffett. Greenblatt's career provided plenty of anecdotal evidence that this is a smart way to win the investment game. But he wanted to prove more rigorously that he had broken the code. So in 2003, he launched a research project that would ultimately cost about $35 million. His mission: to demonstrate that cheap and good companies generate outsized returns. He hired a computer jockey to crunch vast quantities of data, so he could explore how these businesses had performed historically. Greenblatt needed a shorthand measure of cheapness and quality. So he chose 2 metrics as a rough gauge of these essential traits. First, the company should have a high earnings yield, an indication that it generates lots of earnings relative to its price. Second, it should have a high return on tangible capital, an indication that it's a quality business that effectively converts fixed assets and working capital into earnings. XI. The computer was then analyzed 3,500 U.S. stocks, ranking them based on these 2 metrics. Those with the highest combined score should, in general, be above-average businesses trading at below-average prices. Greenblatt wanted to know what would happen if a hypothetical investor bought 30 of these stocks at the start of a year, sold them after a year, then replaced them with a fresh batch of 30 top-ranked stocks. In his study, he assumed that this process would be repeated every year, creating a systematic way of investing in cheap and good companies. XII. Greenblatt was quite amazed by the results of the back tests. From 1988 to 2004, this strategy would have generated an average return of 30.8% a year, versus 12.4% a year for the S&P 500. At that rate, $100,000 would have grown to more than $9.6 million, versus about $730,000 for the S&P 500. Here was a stock-picking strategy that relied solely on 2 metrics, and it annihilated the market. It was a startling testament to the power of simplicity. Greenblatt drew on this research to write his miniature gem, The Little Book That Beats the Market. In between the jokes, he laid out how to beat the pants off even the best investment professionals by using just two simple tools. If you want to become a stock market master, he explained, stick to buying good companies, ones that have a high return on capital, and to buying those companies only at bargain prices, at prices that give you a high earnings yield. He dubbed this simple combination of two winning traits the magic formula. Do you believe in magic? There is just one problem. Most investors fail miserably to become stock market masters, even when you've done all of the hard thinking for them and presented them with a magic formula. After the little book was published in 2005, Greenblatt began to realize how difficult it was to execute the plan he'd recommended to his readers. He and his kids tried doing it, but found it tricky to keep track of so many trades. He adds, I got literally hundreds of emails from people saying, "Hey, thanks for the book. Can you just do this for me?" He also worried that some readers might harm themselves by using unreliable corporate data pulled from the internet, or by messing up the calculations when they tried to apply his formula. What if these errors led them to choose the wrong stocks, and he actually hurt the people he'd set out to help? Greenblatt's solution was to create a free website, www.magicformulainvesting.com, which used reliable data and made it easy to screen for stocks that met his two criteria. He often jokes, there ain't no tooth fairy on Wall Street. But he liked the idea of protecting regular investors. So he also set up what he calls a benevolent brokerage firm, which allowed customers to invest solely in his pre-approved list of magic formula stocks. Greenblatt gave his brokerage clients two choices. Option 1. They could open a professionally managed account, which followed a predetermined process of systematically buying and selling stocks from his approved list at fixed intervals. About 90% of the clients chose this do-it-for-me option, which freed them from making any decisions. Option 2. They could take a DIY approach, picking a recommended minimum of 20 stocks from the same list and deciding for themselves when to buy or sell. The plucky few who opted for this DIY route presumably expected that their own judgment would add a little extra magic. Ah, such hubris! When Greenblatt studied thousands of clients' accounts, he was shocked to discover how much worse the DIY investors performed. Over a 2-year period, this group generated a cumulative return of 59.4% versus 62.7% for the S&P 500. By contrast, the group with professionally managed accounts enjoyed a return of 84.1%, trouncing the S&P 500 index by 21.4 percentage points. Amazingly, the DIY investors had squandered almost 25 percentage points of performance by making their own decisions. Their judgment had transformed a market-beating strategy into a market-trailing dud. It was a startling display of self-sabotage. They made all the faux pas that investors do, says Greenblatt. When the market went up, they piled in. When it went down, they piled out. When the strategy was outperforming, they piled in. When the strategy was underperforming, they stopped doing it. In theory, they may have believed in his concept of buying high-quality businesses at low prices. In practice, they chased after stocks when they were more expensive and abandoned them when they were cheaper. To make matters worse, the DIY investors also shunned the ugliest stocks on the magic formula list, failing to recognize that these were often the most alluring bargains. Emotionally, it was hard to buy the cheapest companies on the list because their near-term prospects looked bleak, and they were frequently tainted by bad news. Fearful of this uncertainty, investors missed out when these beaten-down stocks rebounded and became some of the biggest winners. All of this self-defeating behavior highlights one of the thorniest challenges confronting every investor. It's not enough to find a smart strategy that stacks the odds in your favor over the long haul. You also need the discipline and tenacity to apply that strategy consistently, especially when it's most uncomfortable. It helps immeasurably, says Greenblatt, if you have simple principles that you can just stick to, simple principles that make sense, that are unshakable. Why is this so critical? Because you need this clarity of thought to withstand all of the psychological pressures, setbacks, and temptations that can destabilize or derail you along the way. It's a hard business, and the market is not always agreeing with you, says Greenblatt. It's the nature of the beast that stock prices are emotional, and you're going to be hit from every which way, and you're going to be reading every expert saying you're wrong. It's particularly hard to keep the faith when you're losing money or have lagged the market for several years. You start to wonder if your strategy still works or if something has fundamentally changed. But the truth is, no strategy works all of the time. So these periods of financial and psychic suffering are an unavoidable part of the game. Inevitably, weaker players fall by the wayside, creating more opportunity for those with the sturdiest principles and the strongest temperaments. As Greenblatt puts it, one of the beauties of the pain that people have to take in underperformance is that, if it did not exist, everyone would do what we do. Greenblatt has the conviction to hold firm during those painful periods. But it's easy to see why the average investor might waver. In a back test involving the 1,000 largest companies in the United States, the magic formula generated an average annual return of 19.7% from 1988 to 2009, versus 9.5% annually for the S&P 500. That's a phenomenal margin of victory. Still, the formula trailed the index in 6 of those 22 years, and it produced brutal losses of 25.3% in 2002 and 38.8% in 2008. When you're bleeding that badly, it's hard to remain unflappable unless you share Greenblatt's deep-seated certainty in the inexorable logic of the strategy. These experiences have led him to an important revelation. For most individuals, the best strategy is not the one that's going to get you the highest return. Rather, the ideal is a good strategy that you can stick with, even in bad times. In recent years, that realization has inspired Greenblatt to develop a new mousetrap, a long-short strategy that's designed to reduce risk and provide a less painful ride. His goal, to compound money at a reasonable rate with less violent volatility, so that investors in his funds are more likely to make it to the long term. It's a surprising evolution for a famed gunslinger, whose concentrated approach returned 40% a year for 2 decades. But it's a reminder that most investors should shoot for solid and sustainable returns, instead of something more heroic. When I owned 6 or 8 names, it was not uncommon to lose 20 or 30% in a few days every 2 or 3 years, says Greenblatt. It's a difficult strategy to stick with, so it's not good for most individual investors. But that's perfectly good for me. When something falls 20 or 30%, I don't panic because I know what I own. Nowadays, Greenblatt's team values more than 4,000 businesses and ranks them based on how cheap they are. On the long side, his funds buy hundreds of stocks that trade at a discount to his estimates of fair value. He automatically bets more on the cheapest stock than on the second cheapest. On the short side, he bets against hundreds of stocks that trade at a premium. Again, his position size is determined by valuation, so the most expensive stock is automatically his biggest short position. Our underlying theme is buy the cheapest, short the most expensive, and I do that in a very systematic way, he says. There's no emotion involved. He knows that some bets will go against him, but he's looking merely to be right on average. It's no easy task to execute a complex strategy involving hundreds of long and short positions. Greenblatt built a 20-person team of financial analysts and tech mavens to help him pull it off. Yet the principles underpinning his strategy are, as ever, so simple and robust that all of us would do well to remember them. 1. Stocks are ownership shares of businesses, which must be valued. 2. They should be bought only when they trade for less than they are worth. 3. In the long run, the market is rational and will, more or less, reflect the fair value of these businesses. The problem is that nobody ever knows if this journey toward fair value will take weeks, months, or many years. But Greenblatt is willing to wait, because he trusts that these time-tested principles will eventually hold true. If stocks are ownership shares of businesses and I'm pretty good at valuing them, at least on average, I'll do well over time, he says. The laws of economics and gravity will not be repealed. 4 simple lessons. When I think about everything that I've learned from Greenblatt, I'm struck above all by 4 simple lessons. First, you don't need the optimal strategy. You need a sensible strategy that's good enough to achieve your financial goals. As the Prussian military strategist General Karl von Clausewitz said, the greatest enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect plan. Second, your strategy should be so simple and logical that you understand it, believe in it to your core, and can stick with it even in the difficult times when it no longer seems to work. The strategy must also suit your tolerance for pain, volatility, and loss. It helps to write down the strategy, the principles upon which it stands, and why you expect it to work over time. Think of this as a policy statement or a financial code of conduct. In times of stress and confusion, you can review this document to restore your equilibrium and regain your sense of direction. Third, you need to ask yourself whether you truly have the skills and temperament to beat the market. Greenblatt possesses an unusual combination of characteristics that give him a significant edge. He has the analytical brilliance to deconstruct a complex game, breaking it down into the most fundamental principles. Value a business, buy it at a discount, then wait. He knows how to value businesses. He isn't influenced by conventional opinion or authority figures, such as the Wharton professors who claim that the market is efficient. On the contrary, he delights in proving them wrong again and again. He's also patient, even-tempered, self-assured, competitive, rational, and disciplined. Fourth, it's important to remember that you can be a rich and successful investor without attempting to beat the market. Over several decades, Jack Bogle watched thousands of active fund managers try and fail to prove their long-term superiority over index funds. All these stars prove to be comets, he told me. They light up the firmament for a moment in time. They burn out, and their ashes float gently down to earth. Believe me, it happens almost all the time. Bogle often argued that the ultimate in simplicity is to buy and hold a single balanced index fund that owns a fixed percentage of U.S. and foreign stocks and bonds. And that's it. No self-destructive attempts to time the market. No fantasies of picking the next hot stock or fund. While writing this chapter, I followed his advice and chose a single index fund for my wife's retirement account, a global fund that invests 80% of its assets in stocks and 20% in bonds. I'm sure this is not the optimal strategy, but it should be good enough, assuming that she holds on to the fund for many years and adds to it regularly. This is a simple strategy based on broad diversification, a reasonable balance between risk and reward, tax efficiency, exceptionally low expenses, and a long time horizon. It lacks boldness and panache. But as Bogle told me, you don't have to be great. Personally, I am perennially torn between the mathematical logic of indexing and the dream of beating the market. but I know this much. Whichever path we choose, it pays to keep it simple. Chapter 6: Nick and Zach's Excellent Adventure. A radically unconventional investment partnership reveals that the richest rewards go to those who resist the lure of instant gratification. If by giving up a lesser happiness a greater happiness could be found, a wise person would renounce the lesser for the sake of the greater. The Dhammapada. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Matthew 7:24-27. Nick Sleep dreamed of becoming a landscape architect. He envisioned himself designing parks and public spaces that offered a refuge from the hurly-burly of life. So, after graduating from Edinburgh University, he took a landscaping apprenticeship at a local firm. My romantic notion of what working there might be was completely shattered by the reality, which was that we were working on dormer windows and car parks, he says. A few months later, he was laid off. The staff went from 30 to 20. And I was one of the 10 that was kicked out. Sleep, who is English, wanted to stay in Edinburgh, since he and his future wife, Sarita, had bought a small apartment in the city's suburbs. So I just looked around to see what Edinburgh was good at, he says. A career in information technology seemed like a viable option. But he also learned that Edinburgh had a reputation for fund management. He read an obscure book titled Investment Trusts, explained to help him figure out what the investing business was all about. He came away intrigued. I liked that sense of it being an intellectual investigation. Sleep landed a job as a trainee investment analyst at a small Scottish fund company. He was not abundantly qualified for the job. At college, he had studied geology and then switched to geography, hardly the standard preparation for a stock-picking career. His employment history offered no evidence that he had yearned since birth for a career in finance. He had worked in the Harrods department store, tempied at an IT firm, and secured a sponsorship deal for windsurfing. With his movie star looks and soft-spoken charm, he didn't fit the mold of a corporate drone. Still, as luck would have it, he had stumbled into a field that perfectly suited his idiosyncratic mind. Like all of the best investors, Sleep views the world from an unusual angle. He suspects this stems from his formative experience as a teenager at Wellington College, an English boarding school founded by Queen Victoria. Sleep was one of the few students who lived at home, which meant that he floated free on the periphery of school life. He even worked in a pub on weekends, while most of his classmates stayed on their 400-acre campus. I got comfortable with being different from everyone else early on, he says. I was happy being outside the group. When Sleep was about 20, he fell under the spell of Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an inquiry into values. This memoirist tutorial, which had been rejected by 121 publishers, is a strange but brilliant meditation on what it means to lead a life dedicated to quality. Pirsig exalts people who care so intensely about the quality of their actions and decisions that even the most mundane work becomes a spiritual exercise, a reflection of inner traits such as patience, integrity, rationality, and serenity. Whether you're mending a chair, sewing a dress, or sharpening a kitchen knife, he writes that there is an ugly way of doing it and a high-quality, beautiful way of doing it. For Pirsig, motorcycle maintenance provides an ideal metaphor for how to live and work in a transcendent way. The real cycle you're working on is a cycle called yourself, he writes. The machine that appears to be out there and the person that appears to be in here are not two separate things. They grow toward quality or fall away from quality together. As you might imagine, most of the hyper-ambitious strivers on Wall Street don't have a lot of patience for mystical mumbo-jumbo about motorcycles. But Persig's vision of a soulful, ethical, intellectually honest approach to life resonated deeply with Sleep and shaped the type of investor he would become. In an email about Persig's enduring impact on him, Sleep remarks, "You really want to do everything with quality, as that is where the satisfaction and peace is." But what does this mean when it comes to investing? In 2001, Sleep and his friend Kai's Zakaria created a fund called the Nomad Investment Partnership, which they viewed as a laboratory test for how to invest, think, and behave in the most high-quality way. In one of his eloquent and amusing letters to shareholders, Sleep would muse, "Nomad means far more to us than simply managing a fund. Nomad is a rational, metaphysical, almost spiritual journey, without the sand and camels, although Zach may be happier with them. None of this would matter if it weren't for the stunning outcome of their peculiarly high-minded experiment." Over 13 years, Nomad returned 921.1% versus 116.9% for the MSCI World Index. In other words, their fund beat its benchmark index by more than 800 percentage points. To put that another way, $1 million invested in the index would have grown to $2.17 million, while $1 million invested in Nomad rocketed to $10.21 million. In 2014, Sleep and Zakaria returned their shareholders' money and retired as fund managers at the ripe old age of 45. Since then, they've managed their own money with equally striking success, approximately tripling their wealth in their first 5 years of retirement. Sleep, with characteristic indifference to conventional opinion, invested almost all of his fortune in just 3 stocks. At times, he and Zakaria have had as much as 70% of their money in a single stock. Among the cognoscenti, few other investors are held in such high esteem. Bill Miller, who says he admires the complete independence and clarity of their thinking, invested his own money in Nomad. Guy Spear, who is friends with Sleep, reveres him as one of the most profound thinkers in the investment world. When I asked Monish Pabrai for advice about which investors to interview, he told me, "Nick Sleep is exceptional. He does very deep research and has very high concentration. That's a lot of putting your nuts on the line. He would be a fascinating interview, but he won't do it. He's a very private person." Indeed, part of their mystique lies in the fact that Sleep and Zakaria have always flown under the radar. They had minimal interest in marketing their fund, and even less interest in self-promotion. As a result, their story has never been told. But over the last few years, I've interviewed Sleep on multiple occasions. Then, in the fall of 2018, I spent an afternoon with him and Zakaria at their office on the King's Road in London, a bright and cheery space, which is so informal that Zakaria doesn't even have a desk. He prefers to work in a plush leather armchair, which faces a wall where their matching beekeeper suits hang together from hooks. It was there, in Galactic HQ, that they reflected on what they call their adventures in capitalism. What emerged from our conversations is a heartening morality tale in which the good guys win. It's also a story about the extraordinary advantages that accrue to investors with the discipline and patience to resist the temptations of instant gratification. In a high-speed era dominated by short-term thinking, this capacity to defer rewards is one of the most powerful contributors to success, not only in markets, but in business and life. A house built on sand. Zakaria, like Sleep, never dreamed of working on Wall Street. "To be honest, I would have loved to have done something else," he says. I would have been a meteorologist if my parents had let me. I found it fascinating. I used to read weather reports and do my own weather reports, and my parents thought it was stupid. Born in Iraq in 1969, he came from a relatively privileged family. His father worked for the Iraqi Central Bank. His mother lectured on nutrition at the University of Baghdad. But it was a perilous time, rife with political intrigue and violence. We were purged, says Zakaria. His family fled, leaving everything behind. In 1972, a Catholic charity helped his parents find refuge in the UK, where they would raise their 3 children. They pitched up here with nothing, says Zakaria. Literally nothing except an orange Volvo, which they'd been given by someone in Turkey. His father knocked on doors until he found a job as a junior accountant. He worked his way up, then started a successful business exporting machinery to Iraq. Zakaria's parents expected him to join the firm and eventually run it, helping to expand their cushion against the uncertainties of life. Money is very important to them, he says. The accumulation of money. Not necessarily spending it. It's about security and status. In 1987, Zakaria headed to Cambridge University to study mathematics. Everything seemed on track. But that same year, his father went bankrupt. It turned out that he'd speculated in the stock market using borrowed money. He had traded hot stocks touted in dubious tip sheets and had fallen for pyramid schemes pitched by sleazy salesmen. One stockbroker would recommend a stock based on this pyramid of who was in first and who was in last, says Zakaria. The more money you put in, the higher you got in the pyramid. My father never got high enough, and when it all collapsed, he lost everything. The family was deluged with debt, and the export business died. For Zakaria, it was a sickening introduction to the investment business. My father had made his money on things he understood and lost it on things he didn't understand, and he was taken to the cleaners by very unscrupulous people. These memories left Zakaria with a permanent suspicion of salespeople get-rich-quick schemes and the casino aspect of Wall Street. After graduating from Cambridge in 1990, Zakaria entered the investing game largely by default. The family business was no longer an option. Unlike his siblings, he couldn't become a doctor because he faints at the sight of blood. And meteorology is stupid. So he took a job in Hong Kong as an equity analyst at Jardine Fleming, one of Asia's leading asset managers. It went well enough until 1996. Then his boss, a hotshot fund manager, was accused of allocating successful trades to his own account, allegedly depriving clients of profits that should have been allocated to their accounts. The fund manager was fired and fined millions of dollars. But with the firm's reputation in tatters, the business had to be restructured. Zakaria was laid off. I rang round a couple of friends and said, "Do you have anything? I'll literally do anything." A friend who ran a stockbroking desk at Deutsche Bank took mercy and gave him a job as a sell-side analyst specializing in Asian stocks. It was one of life's cruel cosmic jokes. Zakaria, with his distrust for salespeople in general and stockbrokers in particular, would earn his keep by hawking stock tips to the bank's institutional clients. I did it for 4 years, and it was absolute hell, he says. Not being someone who is easily sold to, I couldn't sell to anyone. His time at Deutsche provided Zakaria with a crash course in the ways of Wall Street. It was a shocking place to work, he says. Moral compromises went with the territory. My good friend and boss there said, "You must never persuade someone not to do what they want to do, even if you think it's wrong. Just let them do it because you'll never be thanked." And I thought, that's a terrible way to live. It's awful. I mean, if you think they're making a mistake, you should tell them. Zakaria says he was so ill-suited to the job that he'd have been fired within a month if his boss hadn't shielded him. Still, there was one consolation. He met Nick Sleep. After 3 years in his first investing job back in Edinburgh, Sleep had become an investment analyst at Sun Life of Canada, a financial services giant with tens of thousands of employees. "I was almost allergic to working there," he says. "Once you've worked for a feisty company, it's quite difficult to go work for something big, dull, and boring." He quit after a few months and landed in 1995 at Marathon Asset Management, where he would stay for more than a decade. It was a scrappy, high-flying investment firm in London that was trying to outbox the big guys. Sleep's mentor there was one of Marathon's co-founders, Jeremy Hosking, an English eccentric whose hobbies include collecting vintage steam engines. "He's naturally iconoclastic," says Sleep. "His bias is to buy just about the most despised thing he can find. He likes the controversy, the difficulty." When the Asian financial crisis struck in 1997, Hosking and Sleep went scavenging for cheap stocks in the smoldering markets of Southeast Asia. Everyone else seemed to be running for cover, as Asia's economic miracle turned to disaster. But the Marathon men found an unlikely ally in an Asia-based broker who wasn't like everyone else, Zakaria. Sleep and Zakaria talked regularly about the crazy bargains they were unearthing in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Most brokers focused on popular assets that were easy to sell. But Zakaria was excited by reviled stocks trading at fabulous discounts. Zach was a rubbish stockbroker because what would appeal to him would appeal to us and would appeal to nobody else, says Sleep. So it had no commercial value. You couldn't sell it to anybody else. But Zakaria's eye for discarded jewels was precisely what made him valuable to Marathon. Hosking told him, "When you can't sell a stock to anyone else, call us." During the miracle years, investors had been so bullish about Asia that they had bet on stocks trading at 3 times the replacement cost of their assets. During the crisis, you could buy those same stocks for 1/4 of the replacement cost of their assets. In less than a year, Marathon invested about $500 million in Southeast Asia and made a killing as the region rebounded. Part of the credit went to Zakaria. "He was exactly the analyst we needed in the Asian crisis," says Sleep. "He was just a salesperson working for an investment bank, but he wasn't really doing a salesperson's job because he wasn't selling what they wanted him to sell." This sense that Zakaria was swimming, somewhat desperately, against the tide was about to intensify. If you were a satirical novelist looking to write about Wall Street at its worst, you might choose a golden age of greed such as late 1999 and early 2000. It was a time when the mania for tech and internet stocks mangled the minds of bankers, brokers, fund managers, and regular investors. Millions of people were consumed by a desire for instant riches, and their only apparent fear was the fear of missing out. Deutsche and its rivals profited handsomely by taking half-baked companies public at inflated valuations, ignoring whatever doubts they may have harbored about whether these businesses would endure. Research analysts at supposedly reputable brokerages acted as shameless stock promoters. II and brokers like Zakaria felt obliged to sell this dreck to investors who either knew no better or dreamed of getting rich before the frenzy faded. This was the ultimate casino. Yet Zakaria refused to play. "The IPOs were all absolutely awful, and I'd tell people they were awful. And of course you wouldn't sell any, and it was all very miserable." One deal etched forever in his mind involved a Taiwanese tech startup, Gigamedia Limited. It was less than 2 years old, and profits were nothing but a distant dream. Undeterred, Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank decided to take it public on Nasdaq in February 2000 at the peak of the bubble. Zachariah says one of his colleagues, "Your archetypal perfect," a fund manager in Paris, and told him, "I think you should buy it." The fund manager placed a $150 million order. There was just one problem. This exceeded the total assets in his fund. Still, nobody seemed to care, since it was all a game. The fund manager was betting that the bank would grant him a fraction of the shares he requested, and that the stock would surge. Lo and behold, Gigamedia's stock shot up from $27 to $88 on the day of the IPO, giving this money-losing minnow a valuation of more than $4 billion. But it was all an illusion. When the dot-com bubble burst a few weeks later, Gigamedia lost 98% of its value. For Zachariah, it was all too much. The irrationality, the lack of substance, the willingness to do whatever it took to make a quick buck regardless of who got hurt. "I suffer from anxiety, and I needed something that was more grounded," he says. "My time at Deutsche Bank was just so bad for me health-wise, because there's nothing grounded in being a stockbroker. You turn up in the morning and you have no idea how your day is going to develop, whether your client is going to like you or hate you, or whether you're going to be sacked or not. It was all so unstable." He was rescued by Marathon. In April 2000, when the dot-com darlings were getting smashed to pieces, Zachariah escaped from Deutsche to work with Sleep as an analyst at Marathon's office in London. In May, they traveled together to Omaha for Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting. "It was wonderful," says Zachariah. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger spoke about companies they expected to own for decades. They weren't rolling the dice on the latest idiotic IPO or scheming to line their pockets at other people's expense. "Oh my God," thought Zachariah. "This is nothing to do with a casino. This is about real businesses." Sleep kept nagging his bosses to let him launch a concentrated fund within Marathon, with Buffett serving as his model. Buffett struck him as the embodiment of quality. It wasn't just the depth of his thinking about businesses, but the honorable way in which he treated Berkshire's shareholders, beginning with his modest salary of $100,000 a year. "At one extreme," says Sleep, "you've got Buffett being as principled as you can possibly be. At the other extreme, there are marketing-driven companies that happen to be selling investment funds, but could be selling cars or washing machines. They couldn't give a toss about their clients." When Sleep's bosses gave him the green light to start the Nomad Investment Partnership in 2001, he asked Zachariah to join him as co-manager of the fund. "It was obvious that we were always going to do something a little bit odd," says Sleep. Indeed, from the start, they regarded Nomad as an act of rebellion against what he calls the sin and folly of the investment industry. "We wanted to prove that there's another way of investing and another way of behaving," says Sleep. "You don't have to go and do all of the Wall Street bollocks. Never mind the bollocks." Sleep and Zachariah had no interest in building a colossal fund that would shower them with fees. They didn't fantasize about appearing as market gurus on CNBC or being fetishized on the cover of Forbes. They had no desire to buy themselves castles, airplanes, or yachts. Their ambition was simple. They wanted to generate superb long-term returns. Specifically, their target was a tenfold increase in Nomad's net asset value. Sleep, who has 3 daughters and a godson, framed this mission in somewhat whimsical terms. If they ever asked him, "What did you do during the war?" he wanted to reply, "We turned 1 pound into 10 pounds. Anyone looking to achieve stellar returns would do well to study what Sleep and Zachariah figured out about where to focus their attention, and, equally important, what they ignored. Sleep cites a line from the philosopher William James: "The art of being wise is the art of knowing what to overlook." He and Zachariah rejected a slew of standard practices. We were just getting rid of all the things we didn't like, says Sleep. We were signed-up members of the awkward squad. For a start, they disregarded all of the ephemeral information that distracts investors from what matters. Sleep notes that information like food has a sell-by date, but some of it is especially perishable, while some has a long shelf life. This concept of shelf life became a valuable filter. For example, when I spoke with Sleep and Zakaria again in May 2020, the financial news was full of speculation about the near-term impact of the COVID-19 virus on consumer spending, corporate profits, unemployment, interest rates, and asset prices. An article in the Financial Times even debated whether a U.S. economic recovery might resemble the letter V, U, W, L, or a Nike swoosh. To Sleep and Zakaria, this fleeting news coverage was all part of the daily soap opera of the market, too superficial, short-lived, and unreliable to hold their attention. They couldn't predict how the economic news would unfold. So why waste mental energy on the unknowable? Similarly, they ignored the flood of short-term financial data and recommendations gushing out of Wall Street. Brokerage firms, which have an incentive to spur activity among investors, crank out unreliable estimates of the next quarter's earnings per share for thousands of companies. Sleep refers dismissively to the quarterly EPS junkies who crave this information, which will already be worthless in 12 weeks. As he sees it, the short-term crowd responds constantly to false stimuli, whether it's the latest economic data point or the trivial news that a company has beaten analysts' expectations. You need to be wired not to believe the bullshit, to not be listening. One practical way of extricating themselves from this muck was to discard all of the sell-side research excreted by Wall Street. We put it in a pile, says Zakaria. Every month or so, you start looking through thinking, I'm bored. So the whole lot would go in the bin. It really was all just gossip and bits of nonsense, and we became very happy with the idea of not hearing it. Likewise, Sleep and Zakaria told stockbrokers that it was pointless phoning them with sales pitches, since they relied on their own research to reach independent conclusions. They also disengaged from the day-to-day action of the market by minimizing their use of a Bloomberg terminal. Fund managers often stare interminably at a wall of 4 monitors flashing real-time data and financial news at them. The Bloomberg, which costs about $24,000 a year to rent, is a status symbol among professional investors. But to this day, Sleep and Zakaria relegate their single Bloomberg monitor to a short side table without a chair. It was meant to be uncomfortable, says Zakaria. Nick wanted it on a low table because you could only spend 5 minutes without thinking, oh, my back's killing me, and you move on. Pat Dorsey, a Chicago-based hedge fund manager, expresses a similar view. The single best thing any investor can do is to not have a TV and a Bloomberg terminal in their office, he once told me. That I have to walk 50 feet down the hall to look at stock prices or check the news on our portfolio is great. It's so tempting. It's like checking email obsessively. You get a little dopamine rush. But as we all know logically and rationally, it's utterly non-productive. This practice of intentional disconnection may seem perverse in a culture that prizes instant access to infinite information. But Sleep and Zakaria disavowed the standard game of ceaselessly collecting data and betting on what it might portend for stocks in the near term. They wanted to think in peace, undisturbed by the popular obsession with what Sleep termed wiggle guessing. It requires uncommon conviction to disregard what most of your peers consider significant. But once they decided to shut off the noise from Wall Street, they felt joyously liberated. It's like a voice in your head that's chattering away all the time, says Sleep. Stop listening to it and you'll be fine. So how did they spend their time? We just read annual reports until we were blue in the face and visited every company we possibly could until we were sick of it. Sleep traveled so much that he filled every page of a supersized passport and had to order another. When they analyzed companies and interviewed CEOs, Sleep and Zakaria probed for insights with a long shelf life. They sought to answer such questions as what is the intended destination for this business in 10 or 20 years? What must management be doing today to raise the probability of arriving at that destination? And what could prevent this company from reaching such a favorable destination? They referred to this way of thinking as destination analysis. Wall Street tends to fixate on short-term outputs, favoring questions such as what will this company's profits be over the next 3 months? And what is our 12-month price target for this stock? Sleep and Zakaria focused instead on the inputs required for a business to fulfill its potential. For example, they wanted to know, is this company strengthening its relationship with customers by providing superior products, low prices, and efficient service? Is the CEO allocating capital in a rational way that will enhance the company's long-term value? Is the company underpaying its employees, mistreating its suppliers, violating its customers' trust, or engaging in any other short-sighted behavior that could jeopardize its eventual greatness? It's worth noting that destination analysis is an equally handy tool in other areas of life. If, say, your goal is to be healthy in old age, you might ask yourself what inputs in terms of nutrition, exercise, stress reduction, medical checkups, and the like are required now to boost your odds of reaching that destination. If you want to be remembered lovingly by your family and friends, you might picture them at your funeral and ask how you need to behave today so they will cherish the memory of you. This emphasis on destinations had a profound impact on Sleep and Zakaria. You want to look back at 80, says Sleep, and think that you treated your clients equitably, did your job properly, gave money away properly, not that you had 4 houses and a jet. It came naturally for them to think along unconventional lines, because they were 2 odd ducks who had landed in the investment industry by accident, a failed landscape architect and a frustrated meteorologist. As perennial outsiders, they questioned everything. Above all, they could never accept the unspoken belief that their own financial interests trumped those of their clients. As a result, Nomad's fee scheme was uncommonly fair. Sleep and Zakaria charged a tiny annual management fee that merely covered their costs, instead of the usual fee of 1 or 2% of assets. They also received 20% of their fund's investment profits, but only after delivering a 6% annual return. If they performed poorly, they would earn no fees at all. A few years later, they stacked the deck even more heavily against themselves by deciding to place their performance fees in a holding bucket for several years. If Nomad subsequently fell short of its 6% annual hurdle, they would refund a portion of those previously earned fees to their shareholders. We quite liked the idea that this wasn't going to be a big payday for us, says Zakaria. We wouldn't make out like bandits as everyone else does. Their attitude was influenced by Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, which Sleep had recommended to Zakaria shortly after they met. The book reinforced their determination to resist any low-quality behavior that seemed self-serving or deceitful. The very rapid rejection of things made life very straightforward, says Zakaria. It was all about quality. Money was secondary. It was much more about doing a good job, a quality job, doing the right thing. I don't think we ever took a decision which was driven by putting money in our pockets. Definitely not, says Sleep, completing Zakaria's thought. There was something a little provocative about the whole thing, says Zakaria. Could you set up an investment outfit which is not about the money? It's about doing everything right. As you'd expect, the priority at most investment firms is to maximize their own profits, which creates some glaring conflicts of interest. For example, they routinely prosper by selling overpriced products that deliver lackluster returns. They also place an overwhelming emphasis on increasing their assets under management, since this generates bounteous fees with which to bankroll lavish salaries and bonuses. It's no secret that investment returns tend to deteriorate as assets expand. But money managers typically resist the logical solution of closing their oversized funds to additional investments. As the author Upton Sinclair wrote, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." By contrast, Nomad was conceived from the start as a vehicle for maximizing returns, not assets. "We had a different morality system," says Sleep. "If you're in the asset-gathering business, then you've got sales guys, you've got compliance guys, you've got client-holding people, you've got bureaucracy, and it becomes this big machine. If you're wanting to compound and have really good investment performance, you don't need any of that crap. We just concentrated on picking good stocks and thought everything else was peripheral." For a start, they regarded sales and marketing as a distraction. They almost never spoke to the media. They didn't care if a potential client was large or small, since their priority was never to build the most lucrative commercial enterprise. They also made it clear that they'd return money to their existing shareholders and turn away new investors if Nomad's size ever became a hindrance to its performance. They repeatedly closed the fund to new subscriptions, starting in 2004 when they managed about $100 million, a paltry sum by industry standards. They reopened only when they could find sufficiently alluring opportunities to deploy additional cash. They also took delight in turning away investors who seemed unsuitable or irritating, regardless of how rich they were. Zakaria chuckles at the memory of a comically awful meeting with a team that managed billions for heirs to the food packaging company Tetra Pak. These financial advisors demanded access to Nomad's proprietary stock research as a condition for investing their clients' money in the fund. Zakaria says the atmosphere grew frostier and frostier, with Sleep crossing his arms and legs in a sign of mounting annoyance. After 15 minutes, Sleep and Zakaria showed their visitors the door. Potential investors were also required to sign a document acknowledging that Nomad was inappropriate for anyone with less than a 5-year time horizon. "I wanted it in a different psychic space than all the other investments they had," says Sleep. "We weren't just another bloody hedge fund. We were tackling the whole investment problem in a different way." Indeed, Nomad rejected all of the get-rich-quick tactics that hedge funds routinely use to pump up their short-term performance, high-testosterone strategies that Sleep dubbed investment Viagras. For example, Nomad never used leverage, never shorted a stock, never speculated with options or futures, never made a macroeconomic bet, never traded hyperactively in response to the latest news, never dabbled in exotic financial instruments with macho names such as LYONs and Prides. Instead, Sleep and Zakaria played what they viewed as a long, simple game, which involved buying a few intensively researched stocks and holding them for years. Their slow, patient, deliberate strategy was so countercultural that it sounds almost quaint. Investor time frames have shortened drastically over the years. When Vanguard's founder, Jack Bogle, entered the investment business in 1951, mutual funds held stocks for an average of about 6 years. By 2000, that figure had shrunk to about 1 year, provoking Bogle to warn that the folly of short-term speculation has replaced the wisdom of long-term investing. In 2006, Sleep wrote to shareholders that Nomad's average holding period for stocks was 7 years, whereas other investors held the U.S. stocks in Nomad's portfolio, excluding Berkshire Hathaway, for an average of only 51 days. Sleep and Zakaria were appalled by this cultural shift toward short-termism. We cannot for the life of us figure out why society at large is served by having company owners swap seats every few months, wrote Sleep. This basic building block of society is broken when those with their hands on the permanent capital change their minds with their underwear. Nomad would succeed by taking the opposite approach. The Bible would say that you want to build your house on rock rather than sand, says Sleep. You want to build something that has permanence. IV. A house built on rock. Sleep and Zakaria named their fund Nomad because they were willing to roam anywhere in search of value. They were not trying to replicate a particular index or perform well on a relative basis. They were gunning for outstanding absolute returns, unconstrained by reference to what anyone else was doing. Their quest took them to some of the least popular corners of the globe. The fund began trading on September 10, 2001, one day before the attack on the Twin Towers. Markets cratered as investors confronted unfathomable threats of terrorism, war, and economic disruption. Adding to the gloom, many investors were still in shock from the bursting of the tech bubble. Sleep and Zakaria invested boldly amid the turmoil, targeting temporarily depressed businesses that others were too scared to own, since the future seemed so precarious. In the Philippines, they invested in Union Cement, the nation's largest cement producer, after its stock had plunged from 30 cents to less than 2 cents. Pessimism was so pervasive that the market valued the business at 1/4 of the replacement cost of its assets. In Thailand, they invested in Madichin, a newspaper publisher whose stock had crashed from $12 to $1. It traded at 0.75 times revenues and was worth about 3 times what they paid for it. In the United States, they bought preferred shares of Lucent Technologies, a fallen telecom star that had lost 98% of its value. These were classic cigar butts, not the best businesses but fantastically cheap. By the end of 2003, Nomad's net asset value had doubled as opportunistic bets like these paid off. The supply of bargains dwindled as fears receded and markets revived. So Sleep and Zakaria ventured to one of the few remaining pockets of despair. In 2004, they crossed the border from South Africa into Zimbabwe. Under Robert Mugabe's despotic rule, Zimbabwe's economy was paralyzed by corruption, a currency collapse, the nationalization of many privately owned farms, and mobs of looters. Undaunted, Sleep and Zakaria bought a basket of 4 Zimbabwean stocks, virtual monopolies that traded as if they were almost worthless. Zimsum, a cement producer, sold on the stock exchange in Harare for 1/70th of the replacement cost of its assets. Writing to Nomad's investors about the perverse appeal of this detested market, Sleep remarked, "The clients will hate it. Compliance will hate it. The consultants will hate it. Marketing will hate it. The size of the investment opportunity is tiny. It is not part of the benchmark. It's perfect." For a while, Nomad valued its basket of bargains at 0, because trading on Zimbabwe's stock exchange ceased entirely. The economy remained a catastrophe. Still, by the time Nomad sold the last of its Zimbabwean stocks in 2013, they'd risen between 3-fold and 8-fold. As a souvenir, Sleep and Zakaria gave each Nomad shareholder a worthless banknote for 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, which the government had issued at the height of hyperinflation. Nomad's appetite for reasonable businesses selling at unreasonably low prices made sense, given the opportunities available at the time. But this strategy had one drawback. When stocks like these rebounded and were no longer that cheap, they had to sell them and hunt for new bargains. But what if nothing particularly attractive was on sale when they sought to redeploy those winnings? An obvious solution to this reinvestment risk was to buy and hold higher quality businesses that were more likely to continue compounding for many years. This second strategy grew out of a costly mistake. In 2002, Nomad made its biggest wager to date, investing in Stagecoach, a debt-ridden British bus operator that had overreached disastrously while expanding overseas. The stock had crashed from £2.85 to 14p, but Sleep and Zakaria figured it could easily be worth 60p. In part, they were betting on a turnaround led by the founder, a former bus conductor who'd run the firm so adroitly in the past that he'd become one of Britain's richest people. He came out of semi-retirement to streamline the business and refocus on its neglected cash cow, the UK bus operation. His strategy worked. Sleep and Zakaria cashed out at around 90p and congratulated themselves on a six-fold gain. But Stagecoach was a better business than they'd realized. In late 2007, the stock hit £3.68. "We felt like a bit of a horse's arse," says Sleep. "We had framed it in our own minds as only ever being a cigar butt." Sleep and Zakaria started searching for other businesses run by far-sighted managers whom they could trust to keep building wealth over time. "If they're thinking rationally and thinking about the long term," says Sleep, "you can subcontract the capital allocation decisions to them. You don't have to be buying and selling shares." They also began to wonder what characteristics account for the success of companies with unusually long shelf lives, and they would reach the revelatory conclusion that one business model may be more powerful than all the rest. Their term for it is scale economies shared. The company that introduced them to this model was Costco Wholesale, an American discount retailer that embodied everything they sought in a business. When they first invested in Costco in 2002, its stock had tumbled from $55 to $30 amid concerns about the company's low profit margins. But Sleep and Zakaria saw underappreciated strength in Costco's fanatical focus on delivering value to shoppers. At the time, its customers paid a $45 annual membership fee, which gave them access to warehouses filled with dependable products sold at the lowest possible prices. Costco marked up its goods by no more than 15% above cost, while a typical supermarket might mark up prices by 30%. Members had no need to forage elsewhere for bargains, because Costco treated them so fairly. The company could have jacked up its prices and boosted margins, but that would have jeopardized its members' trust. To the skeptics on Wall Street, this generosity seemed soft and uncompetitive, the corporate equivalent of collectivism. But Sleep and Zakaria saw the long-term logic of Costco's largesse. Satisfied customers kept returning and spending more money in its stores, thereby generating enormous revenues. As the company grew, it negotiated better deals with suppliers and kept driving down its famously low costs. Costco then shared these economies of scale with consumers by lowering its prices even further. Sleep and Zakaria estimated that its members saved $5 for every $1 that Costco kept for itself. The effect of this policy of self-restraint was a virtuous cycle that Sleep sums up like this: increased revenues begets scale savings, begets lower costs, begets lower prices, begets increased revenues. Most big, successful corporations eventually lapse into mediocrity. But Costco's readiness to share the benefits of its scale with customers meant that size became an advantage, not a burden, enabling the company to extend its edge over rivals that boasted higher margins. Costco, which was founded in 1983, kept growing by giving back, instead of grabbing all of the spoils for itself. Its low margins reflected patience, not weakness. Writing to Nomad's investors, Sleep explained, "The firm is deferring profits today in order to extend the life of the franchise. Of course, Wall Street would love profits today, but that's just Wall Street's obsession with short-term outcomes." Sleep and Zakaria kept adding to their investment as their reverence for Costco grew. By 2005, it accounted for 1/6 of Nomad's assets. Today, it remains one of the linchpins in their personal portfolios. During the 18 years they've owned the stock, it's risen from $30 to about $380, while also paying rich dividends. Still, they have no intention of selling it anytime soon, given the likelihood that Costco will continue to advance toward a desirable destination. One benefit of their inactivity is that Sleep and Zakaria had time to read, think, and talk at length about what they were learning. Sleep has the mental agility to skip lightly between different disciplines, from business history to religion, neuroscience to sports, and to identify common themes and patterns. Zakaria, whom Sleep describes as hugely intelligent, has less breadth, but tends to probe more deeply. One subject they often discussed was the question of which business models work best. They kept a list of them on a whiteboard in their office. What emerged from these discussions was a conviction that nothing matches the might of the scale economy's shared model in fostering corporate longevity. When they studied Walmart's annual reports from the 1970s, they realized that it had much in common with Costco. Likewise, durable winners such as Dell Computer, Southwest Airlines, and Tesco all followed a similar path. These formidably efficient firms kept costs low and passed most of their savings back to consumers, who reciprocated by doing more business with them. In the same vein, GEICO and the Nebraska Furniture Mart, two of Buffett's favorite businesses, continued to drive down costs as they grew, enabling them to save their customers so much money that it became increasingly difficult for rivals to compete. Henry Ford pulled off a similar trick a century ago, harnessing the benefits of assembly line production to drop the price of a Model T touring car from $850 in 1908 to less than $300 in 1925. So it's not a new business model, says Sleep, but it does need to be pursued with an evangelical zeal. The culture of such companies is typically molded by visionary founders, not hired hands. They tend to be passionate about the smallest details, improving the customer experience, cutting costs even in good times, and investing for the distant future despite external pressures to report strong numbers now. They have to be almost high on being iconoclastic, says Sleep. These legendary figures include Sam Walton at Walmart, Jim Singal at Costco, Herb Kelleher at Southwest, and Rose Blumkin at Nebraska Furniture Mart. Blumkin, a Russian immigrant who worked from the age of 6 until after her 100th birthday, built America's biggest home furnishings business by faithfully observing 3 commandments. Sell cheap, tell the truth, don't cheat nobody. Once Sleep and Zakaria understood the magic of this one business model, they made it the overriding focus of their fund. The attraction of cigar butts waned, and they concentrated instead on a handful of companies that shared their economies of scale with customers. They were acutely aware of how little in life we ever truly know. But they knew that they had uncovered a deep truth. That's the best single thought you may have ever had in your life, says Sleep. It needs to dominate everything, because you're not going to get many insights like that. Everything else is a bit low quality, isn't it? It's a bit transitory. It doesn't make a big difference. Sleep and Zakaria packed their portfolio with companies cut from the same cloth. They bet 15% of Nomad's assets on ASOS, a British online fashion retailer with a cost advantage over traditional high street stores, and rode its stock up from £3 to £70. They invested heavily in Carpetrite, a chain founded by Lord Harris, a British entrepreneur with severe dyslexia who inherited his father's small business at 15 and ended up with hundreds of stores across Europe. Nomad also became the largest foreign shareholder of AirAsia, the world's lowest-cost airline. And then there was Amazon.com, the ultimate practitioner of scale economies shared. When Sleep first encountered Amazon in 1997, it was an upstart bookseller preparing to go public. Its founder, Jeff Bezos, gave a presentation in London, explaining how his profitless startup would offer an almost infinite selection of books, how it would gain a cost advantage by avoiding the expense of physical stores, and how it would reinvest its cash flow in other businesses. Sleep raced back to his office at Marathon and told his boss, "This is absolutely fantastic. It could be huge." And he says, "Yeah, okay, Nick, but what are they doing that nobody else can do?" Yeah. It took years for Sleep and Zakaria to grasp the nature of Amazon's competitive advantage. But eventually, the penny dropped. Bezos was following in the hallowed footsteps of the Ford Walton Single gang, and the internet would enable him to turbocharge their classic strategy. Like them, Bezos was ruthlessly efficient about controlling costs. According to Sleep, Amazon even went so far as to save $20,000 a year by removing the light bulbs from vending machines in its offices. Bezos was obsessed with saving money and time for customers. And he invested patiently for the future, seeding new business initiatives that he didn't expect to bear fruit for 5 to 7 years. Each year, he invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the form of discounted prices and shipping subsidies, a consummate display of deferred gratification. True to form, Wall Street grumbled about Amazon's lack of reported profits, failing to appreciate that Bezos was patiently laying the groundwork for mind-blowing growth. Writing to Amazon shareholders in 2005, Bezos explained that relentlessly returning efficiency improvements and scale economies to customers in the form of lower prices creates a virtuous cycle that leads over the long term to a much larger dollar amount of free cash flow, and thereby to a much more valuable Amazon.com. Sleep and Zakaria had found their corporate soulmate. That year, Bezos launched Amazon Prime, a membership service that offered free 2-day shipping for an annual fee of $79. He would later sweeten the deal by throwing in everything from free movies and TV shows to unlimited storage of photographs. In the short run, this overabundance of benefits and savings would hurt the bottom line. In the long run, it would strengthen customer loyalty and spur even more spending. When Bezos unveiled Prime, Sleep and Zakaria recognized instantly that it was the Amazonian equivalent of Costco's annual membership fee. "Oh my God, I know exactly what game they're playing here," thought Sleep. Amazon suddenly became Costco on speed. Nomad started buying Amazon aggressively in 2005, at around $30 per share. In 2006, Sleep and Zakaria resigned from Marathon and made Nomad a fully independent fund, giving themselves even more latitude to follow their idiosyncratic convictions. They bet 20% of the fund's assets on Amazon and secured permission from their shareholders to go beyond that limit. A quarter of their clients yanked their money from Nomad, fearful of its overexposure to one stock. Skepticism about Amazon continued to swirl. In the midst of the 2008 market meltdown, Sleep attended an event in New York where George Soros spoke about the threat of an impending financial apocalypse. Soros, one of the most successful traders in history, named just one stock that he was shorting as the world fell apart: Amazon. Over lunch that day, Sleep caught up with Bill Miller, whose mutual funds owned the largest outside stake in Amazon. Miller had recognized Amazon's strengths earlier than anyone else and had bought 15% of the company. But he told Sleep that he'd been forced to reduce his holdings to meet redemption requests from investors fleeing from his funds. Sleep phoned Zakaria in London that evening and asked, "Are you sure we know what we're doing, because everyone here is going in another direction?" They had never felt more confident about a company's eventual greatness. But what if they'd misanalyzed the business? What if they'd missed something and all the doubters were right? Either we're brilliant, thought Sleep, or we're really toast. Amazon lost almost half of its market value in 2008, while Nomad fell 45.3%. Sleep and Zakaria held an emergency meeting in an appropriately posh location, McDonald's, to discuss the possibility that Nomad's future might be in peril if the market continued to crash. They shuddered at the thought of ending up as analysts at some shitty Wall Street firm. Still, they didn't crack. While others panicked, they exploited the market mayhem to upgrade their portfolio, concentrating even more heavily on the highest quality companies, including Amazon, Costco, ASOS, and Berkshire Hathaway. When the rebound came, the rewards were breathtaking. From 2009 through 2013, Nomad returned 404%. In early 2014, Sleep and Zakaria dissolved the Nomad investment partnership. By then, it had grown to about $3 billion in assets, giving them the scale to earn astronomical sums. But that had never been the purpose of their great adventure. Many funds start with lots of cake as their goal, Sleep writes in an email. It's not the cake that gratifies us. What we found gratifying was the process of solving the investment problem, learning along the way and doing as good a job as we knew how. They are all internal personal goals. The cake was then a happy byproduct. Zakaria, in particular, worried that the work would become repetitive. Intellectually, we felt we had completely sucked it dry, he says. We had thought about this from every angle, about what we thought was important, and I think I'm right saying there was nothing left. So they retired, hoping to devote the second half of their lives to supporting charitable causes. Sleep wrote a letter to Buffett, thanking him for his role in Nomad's success. Buffett replied, "You and Zach have made the right choice. I predict you will find life is just beginning." In less than 13 years, Nomad had gained a staggering 921% before fees, just short of their target of turning £1 into £10. Amazon, which had risen tenfold since 2005, had played a pivotal role. At one point, it had grown to about 40% of the fund's assets. In retirement, Zakaria kept half a dozen or so of his favorite stocks from Nomad's portfolio. His biggest holding, Amazon, surpassed $3,000 per share in 2020, giving it a market value of $1.5 trillion and making Bezos the world's richest person. Zakaria, who has never sold a share of Amazon in his personal portfolio, has about 70% of his money riding on that one stock. The rest is almost entirely invested in Costco, Berkshire Hathaway, and an online retailer named Boohoo.com. Zakaria says he occasionally glances at his portfolio and wonders, what would Nick do? And I think Nick wouldn't do anything. And I go, okay, that's done for another 6 months. Yeah. As for Sleep, he invested almost all of his money in just 3 stocks, Amazon, Costco, and Berkshire. There are very few businesses that are investing in the future the way they are, he says. They don't care about Wall Street. They don't care about the trends and the fads. They're just doing the right thing long term. The volatility of a 3-stock portfolio didn't bother him, given the high probability that all 3 businesses would reach a desirable destination. However, by 2018, Amazon had risen so meteorically that it accounted for more than 70% of his net worth. Sleep began to worry. Could its market value grow to $3 trillion or $4 trillion, or were there limits even to Amazon's greatness? He wasn't sure. So, after 13 years, He sold half of his stake in a single day for $1,500 a share. How did it feel? I hated it, he says. I felt horribly conflicted, and I'm not sure it's a good decision. For a while, Sleep sat patiently on tens of millions of dollars in cash, not sure how to invest his windfall from selling those shares in Amazon. But when we spoke in 2020, he had invested the money in a fourth stock, ASOS, an online retailer that he'd previously owned at Nomad. Since he repurchased it, the stock had already doubled. In short, life is still sweet. 5 lessons with a long shelf life. As I see it, there are 5 key lessons to be learned from Sleep and Zakaria. First, they provide a compelling example of what it means to pursue quality as a guiding principle in business, investing, and life. A moral and intellectual commitment inspired by Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. It's easy to dismiss quality as a vague and subjective notion, but it offers a surprisingly useful filter for many decisions. For example, it was obvious to Sleep and Zakaria that a low annual management fee that merely covered Nomad's operating costs was a higher quality option than a fatter fee that would enrich them regardless of how they performed. Second, there is the idea of focusing on whatever has the longest shelf life, while always downplaying the ephemeral. This principle applied not only to the information they weighed most heavily, but also to the long-lasting companies they favored. Third, there is the realization that one particular business model, scale economies shared, creates a virtuous cycle that can generate sustainable wealth over long periods. Sleep and Zakaria took this one great insight and profited massively from it by focusing on a few high-quality businesses that followed a similar path. Paradoxically, they also argued that it was less risky for them to own a small number of stocks, usually about 10, than to own hundreds, a standard strategy that would inevitably have produced less dazzling returns. We knew that we didn't know many things, says Sleep. So it made sense to us only to have a few shares, because those were the only things we ever understood and ever really knew. It was no surprise to them that the businesses they knew the best and loved the most, Amazon, Costco, and Berkshire, proved remarkably resilient even when the world was turned upside down by COVID-19. After all, their economies of scale enabled them to provide customers with exceptional value for money. With Amazon and Costco in particular, what you've seen is their businesses being enhanced by the crisis, says Zakaria. The worse the environment gets for the economy in general, the better it gets for these cost-advantaged businesses. Fourth, it's not necessary to behave unethically or unscrupulously to achieve spectacular success, even in a voraciously capitalistic business where self-serving behavior is the norm. During the financial crisis, Sleep wrote about the destruction caused by a culture in which the players just have to win, and are not too squeamish about the means. He and Zakaria wanted Nomad to embody a more enlightened form of capitalism. This explains why they adopted a fee scheme that favored their shareholders over themselves. They were generous to each other, too. For example, Zakaria insisted that Sleep should own 51% of their investment firm, instead of an equal share. If a disagreement were ever to arise, Zakaria trusted Sleep to make the final decision. Sleep says it was unthinkable to abuse a partner who had loaded a revolver, passed it across the table, and said, "Go on then, you can shoot me if you like." He adds, "There's a kindness to the relationship, which I think is important to our success." It's telling that they still share an office several years after winding up their fund. As Sleep puts it, good behavior has a longer shelf life. A strong emphasis on charity is also a distinguishing feature of their gentle version of capitalism. Once we had proved what we wanted to do running Nomad, it was very obvious to both of us that the job at hand was to give the money back to society, says Sleep. It lowers the risk of us being bent out of shape by having too much money. Plus, you have the joy of giving it away. Zachariah and his wife, Maureen, support an array of charities that are oriented towards scientific research and medicine, including the London Mathematical Laboratory, the Royal Society, and the Royal Hospital for Neurodisability. Meanwhile, Sleep spends much of his time helping On-Side Youth Zones, a charity that creates safe havens where kids in poor areas can socialize and learn new skills. He says the primary focus for him and Zachariah has shifted to doing the maximum amount of good over the very long term. That said, Sleep hasn't renounced all worldly pleasures. He loves motor racing and competes regularly in his 1965 Shelby Mustang GT350 and his 1967 Lola T70. He also took part with his daughter Jess in a 36-day rally from Beijing to Paris, via Mongolia and Siberia, taking turns driving his 1964 Mercedes Pagoda. Fifth, in a world that's increasingly geared toward short-termism and instant gratification, a tremendous advantage can be gained by those who move consistently in the opposite direction. This applies not only to business and investing, but to our relationships, health, careers, and everything else that matters. Deferring gratification is no easy task, given the environment in which we live. In wealthier nations, everything is available on demand: limitless food, information, bingeable TV shows, every flavor of porn, or whatever else tickles our fleeting fancy. Our attention spans are shortening under a high-speed bombardment of emails, text messages, Facebook posts, and Twitter notifications. Similarly, in the investment realm, we can now dart in and out of the market instantaneously by pushing a few keys on our mobile phones. We're all struggling in our own ways to adjust to this technological and social revolution, which is both miraculous and perilous. As pleasure-seeking creatures, we tend to be drawn to whatever feels good now, despite the price that we or others may have to pay later. This is evident not just in our individual lives, but collectively in everything from government deficits to unconstrained energy consumption. It's all about deferred gratification, says Sleep. When you look at all the mistakes you make in life, private and professional, it's almost always because you reached for some short-term fix or some short-term high. And that's the overwhelming habit of people in the stock market. Just think for a moment of the many unchecked impulses that ruin investors' returns. For example, the tendency to trade too frequently, to make emotional decisions based on alarming or alarmist news stories, to join the herd in charging after the most popular and overpriced assets, to dump funds that have lagged for a year or two, or to sell winning stocks prematurely instead of leaving them to compound for years. The ability to resist such urges is one of those big superpowers, says Sleep. You need to give it huge weight when you're weighing what works. Sleep and Zachariah are titans of impulse control. How else could they have held Costco for 18 years and Amazon for 16 years, while it has soared from $30 to more than $3,000 per share? They understood the fundamental truth that we benefit by deferring gratification and prioritizing long-term outcomes. But it's not enough to grasp this principle intellectually. Equally important, they constructed an internally consistent ecosystem that supported such behavior. For a start, most of their investors were nonprofits, such as college endowments, with expansive time horizons. In his shareholder letters, Sleep praised them effusively for their gentle patience, a tactful way of reinforcing the right mindset. Nomad also invested in businesses run by fellow nonconformists, such as Bezos and Buffett, who took an exceptionally long view. It helped, too, that Sleep and Zachariah set themselves up in a peaceful office above a Chinese herbal medicine store on the King's Road, far removed from the frenetic action in major investment hubs. They also eliminated disruptive influences by shunning sell-side analysts and financial consultants who compulsively monitor the day-to-day performance of funds. They were so detached from all of the drama and excitement that they likened themselves to hermits or monks. If you and I hope to achieve long-lasting success as investors, we need to follow their example by systematically resisting the external and internal forces that push us to act impetuously. With that in mind, I ignore all of the useless media chatter about looming market corrections and crashes. I go weeks on end without checking how my investments have performed. My default position is to do nothing. Hence, the majority of my portfolio sits quietly in 2 index funds and a value-oriented hedge fund, all of which I've owned for at least 20 years. My costliest mistakes have come whenever I grew impatient or envious of other people's returns and strayed off course by gambling on private companies or individual stocks that held the promise of a racier route to riches. The paradox here is that the slower road almost always proves to be faster in the end. The investors I admire most tend to be heroically inactive, not because they're lazy, but because they recognize the benefits of patience. Howard Marks once told me, our performance doesn't come from what we buy or sell. It comes from what we hold. So the main activity is holding, not buying and selling. I've always wondered if it wouldn't enhance an organization to say, we only trade on Thursdays. And the other 4 days of the week, all you can do is sit and think. Nobody personifies this slow-motion mindset better than Thomas Russo, who has generated market-beating returns over more than 3 decades at Gardner Russo & Gardner, which is based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I call myself a farmer, says Russo. Wall Street is flooded with hunters, people who try to go out and find the big game. They fell it and bring it back, and there's a huge feast and everything is fabulous, and then they look for the next big game. I plant seeds, and then I spend all of my time cultivating them. His biggest holdings include Berkshire Hathaway, Brown-Forman, and Nestlé, all of which he's owned since the 1980s. A few years ago, when he was 59, I asked Russo if he expected to own Berkshire and Nestlé for the rest of his life. He replied without hesitation, I would think so. Like Sleep and Zaccaria, Russo has built his entire career on an appreciation of the power of deferred rewards. All of the businesses he owns share one trait, which he describes as the capacity to suffer. That's to say, they invest for the very long haul, even when this expense requires them to stomach years of painful upfront losses. As Russo remarks, we tend to benefit whenever we sacrifice something today to gain something tomorrow. What's fascinating to me is that this timeless principle applies not only to business and investing, but to every area of our lives. We can see it when we exercise or diet, when we study hard for an exam or stay late at work, and when we save money or invest for retirement. In each case, we profit in the long run by embracing or enduring something that seems unappealing in the short run. Conversely, says Sleep, I think it's almost always true that the things we do that make us unhappy look appealing in the short term. He cites an array of popular pitfalls: getting drunk, eating too much cake, telling lies, visiting girly bars, and nicking sweets from a corner shop. In the moment, he says, all of these things seem like a good idea. They're exciting. They reward. There's a bit of a rush. But in the end, they borrow from the long term. None of this is new. In the book of Genesis, Esau, a sucker for instant gratification, trades his precious birthright to his brother Jacob in return for a worthless bowl of lentil soup. By contrast, Jacob's son, Joseph, a master of deferred gratification, has the foresight to set aside vast quantities of grain during the 7 years of abundance, ensuring that Egypt survives the 7 years of famine that follow. thousands of years later, we're presented over and over with this same choice between the present and the future, the instant and the deferred. For most of us mortals, it's a challenging choice. But Zacchaeus says he enjoyed the slightly pious feeling of donning a hair shirt and rejecting instant gratification, while others succumbed to temptation. This reminds me of a marvelous Buddhist phrase that's used to describe one of the subtle rewards of resisting unhealthy or unskillful behavior, the joy of non-remorse. Likewise, Kabbalists such as Rav Yehuda Ashlag and Rav Philip Berg teach that the only way to achieve enduring happiness, fulfillment, and freedom is to resist our negative inclinations. In his landmark book Kabbalah for the layman, Rav Berg writes, instead of choosing the line of least resistance, the quick fix, instant gratification, the Kabbalist chooses the line of most resistance. It's a profoundly important truth about the counterintuitive path to contentment. One practical trick, says Sleep, is to reward yourself in the short term by relishing the prospect of all the wonderful benefits you will enjoy because you chose to override your desire for instant gratification. That way, deferral becomes associated with pleasure, and you're much more likely to embrace it. Indeed, says Sleep, I quite like the overriding because you just know that it's going to make your life better. Chapter 7, High-Performance Habits. The best investors build an overwhelming competitive advantage by adopting habits whose benefits compound over time. It makes no small difference, then, whether we form habits of one kind or of another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference. Aristotle. I think that people underestimate, until they get older, they underestimate just how important habits are, and how difficult they are to change when you're 45 or 50, and how important it is that you form the right ones when you're young. Warren Buffett. In 1990, Tom Gaynor weighed 190 pounds. Nobody would have mistaken him for an Olympic gold medalist in beach volleyball. Still, he says, his weight was within the realm of reasonableness. That year, at age 28, he took a job running the investment portfolio at the Markel Corporation, an insurance firm based in Richmond, Virginia. Investing is a sedentary sport that largely entails reading, thinking, and playing with numbers. Gaynor was built exquisitely for it. Even as a boy of 8 or 9, his idea of an enjoyable Friday evening was to sit in front of the TV with his grandmother and watch Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser. As he grew older, Gaynor's talent for sitting and thinking had an unintended consequence. His weight gradually drifted above 200 pounds. Determined to drift no more, he proclaimed to friends and colleagues that he'd lose 1 pound per year for the next 10 years. That may sound absurdly unambitious, but some studies suggest that the average American male gains 1 to 2 pounds per year between early adulthood and middle age. Gaynor, a master of compounding money, understood how small advantages, or disadvantages, add up over long periods. So he set about changing the unhealthy habits of a lifetime. As a kid, I had the diet of a campground raccoon, he says. For example, he reckons that he ate about 200 donuts per year. Some dieters would have renounced such sinful pleasures entirely, committing, for a while, to a joyless donut-free existence before, almost inevitably, falling off the wagon. Not Gaynor. He cheerfully confesses that he might still eat 20 donuts per year. Overall, though, he's done an admirable job of sticking with a healthy diet. I've eaten several meals with him over the years, including lunch at an old-fashioned club in New York, where he ordered a Caesar salad with salmon and unsweetened iced tea, 2 lunches at his office, more salad, more fish, and dinner at his home in the suburbs of Richmond, where he cooked a delicious pesto-flavored salmon with Brussels sprouts, accompanied with wine and followed with ice cream. Nutritionally, as in other areas of life, Gainer's strategy is to be directionally correct, not perfect. In general, he says, I'm a satisfier, not an optimizer. He has taken a similar approach to exercise. I was never very good at athletics, he says. The peak